Historical Western mail-order bride romance, romantic Western audiobook, full-length audiobook, The Boston Bride Who Chose Love Over Everything by Shelfie Bennett, Chapter 1, Arrival at Fort Lincoln. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the stagecoach window as Fort Abraham Lincoln emerged from the Dakota prairie like a wooden island in an ocean of grass. The military outpost sprawled before her, its high palisade walls and corner watchtowers stark against the endless blue sky. After 3 bone-jarring days of travel from Bismarck, the sight of civilization, even this remote frontier version, sent relief flooding through her travel-weary bones. "Fort Lincoln, miss," the driver called down from his perch. "End of the line." Ellie gathered her reticule and smoothed her emerald traveling dress, checking that her small notebook remained secure in the silk-lined pocket. The leather journal contained her father's letter of introduction and her carefully outlined plans for the articles that would make her reputation. She'd dreamed of this moment for months, her chance to prove that a woman could write with the same authority and insight as any man, perhaps more so when it came to capturing the human stories behind the headlines. The coach lurched to a halt beside the fort's main gate, dust billowing around the wheels. Through the settling cloud, Ellie glimpsed blue uniforms approaching. She took a steadying breath, lifted her chin, and prepared to meet her destiny. The door swung open, revealing a young soldier with earnest brown eyes and a freshly shaved face that couldn't have seen more than 20 summers. He swept off his cavalry hat and offered a crisp salute. "Ms. Whitmore, I presume?" "Private Mitchell, ma'am. Colonel Hayes sends his compliments and requests the honor of your immediate attendance." Ellie accepted his offered hand and stepped down from the coach, her traveling boots finding purchase on the packed earth. The prairie wind caught her skirts, and she was grateful for the weight of the heavy wool that kept her modest, despite the breeze's insistent tugging. How thoughtful of the colonel! She smoothed her gloves and surveyed the bustling activity within the fort's walls. Soldiers moved with purposeful efficiency, some leading horses to the stables, others carrying supplies toward the long, low buildings that lined the interior walls. The American flag snapped proudly atop its pole, and somewhere a bugle called the changing of the guard. "I confess, Private Mitchell, that after the rigors of the journey, I find myself quite eager to begin my work here." The young man's face brightened with unmistakable admiration. "Yes, ma'am, the whole fort's been talking about your arrival. We don't often receive such distinguished visitors, especially ladies of your... that is to say..." He colored slightly and fumbled with his hat. "Your reputation as a journalist precedes you, Miss Whitmore." Ellie smiled, the expression coming easily despite her fatigue. She had learned long ago to put nervous young men at ease, a skill that served her well in her profession. "You flatter me, Private, though I must say, I'm impressed by the efficiency with which news travels in these remote parts." "Oh, it's not so remote as all that, miss. We get the Eastern papers regular like, and your father's Herald is much admired among the officers. Why, Lieutenant Morrison was just saying how your article about the railroad expansion showed real understanding of the financial complexities involved." The driver had begun unloading her trunks, and Ellie watched with some concern as he handled her precious cargo. One trunk contained her extensive wardrobe, carefully selected to maintain her dignity and authority in this masculine environment. The other held her writing supplies, research materials, and books. Both were essential to her success. "Careful with those, if you please," she called to the driver, then turned back to Private Mitchell. "I must admit, I'm quite eager to meet Lieutenant Morrison and the other officers. My father speaks highly of the military men stationed at frontier posts. He says they possess a clarity of purpose and strength of character that serves as inspiration to us all." Private Mitchell positively glowed at this praise. "If you'll follow me, ma'am, I'll escort you to the colonel's quarters. He's arranged for you to take your meals with the officers and has prepared the finest accommodations the fort can offer." They passed through the main gate, and Ellie felt the weight of curious stares from every corner of the compound. Word of her arrival had indeed spread quickly. She kept her back straight and her expression pleasantly composed, aware that first impressions would color every interaction to follow. The interior of Fort Lincoln buzzed with controlled activity. To her left, the blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil in steady rhythm. Ahead, a group of cavalry soldiers practiced mounting and dismounting, their spurs jingling with each movement. The scents of wood smoke, leather, and horses mingled in the crisp autumn air. "The colonel's quarters are just here, miss." Private Mitchell gestured toward a substantial log building with a covered porch and glass windows, luxuries that spoke of the commander's rank and the fort's relative importance. "Shall I see to your luggage?" "Please do, and thank you for your courtesy." Ellie paused at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back across the parade ground. "Tell me, Private, what should I expect to find here? I've read the military reports, of course, but I'm far more interested in the human stories, the daily lives of the men and families who make their home in this wilderness." The young soldier's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, ma'am, it's not an easy life. I won't lie to you about that. The winters are harsh, and there's always the worry about conflicts with the local tribes. But there's good men here, and they're doing important work keeping the peace and protecting the settlers." Ellie made a mental note of his hesitation regarding the tribes. Such delicate subjects would require careful handling in her articles, but they were precisely the sort of complex issues that would distinguish her work from the sensationalized accounts that filled too many Eastern newspapers. "I'm sure I'll find the reality far more nuanced than the headlines suggest," she said diplomatically. Before Private Mitchell could respond, the door to the colonel's quarters opened with authority. A man of perhaps 45 emerged, his blue uniform impeccable despite the frontier setting. Distinguished silver touched his dark hair at the temples, and his bearing spoke of years of command. This could only be Colonel Hayes. "Miss Whitmore." His voice carried the crisp tone of military precision, but his smile was genuinely warm. "Welcome to Fort Abraham Lincoln. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous?" Ellie mounted the steps and extended her hand, which he took with proper decorum. "Colonel Hayes, the pleasure is entirely mine. Your reputation for maintaining order in these challenging circumstances has reached all the way to Boston." "You honor me, miss, though I suspect you'll find our little outpost rather different from what you're accustomed to in civilized society." He gestured for her to precede him into the building. "I confess, when I received your father's letter, I was both surprised and intrigued. It's not often we host a journalist of your caliber, and never one so—" He paused diplomatically. "So female," Ellie supplied with a knowing smile as she stepped into the colonel's office. The room was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a large desk, several chairs, and maps of the Dakota Territory covering one entire wall. A stone fireplace crackled cheerfully against the autumn chill. Colonel Hayes chuckled, closing the door behind them. "I was going to say distinguished, but yes, your gender does make this somewhat unprecedented. I'll speak plainly, Miss Whitmore. Some of my officers were skeptical about housing a young lady, concerned about the propriety and the potential complications." Ellie settled into the chair he indicated, arranging her skirts carefully. She had expected this conversation and had prepared for it thoroughly. "Colonel, I appreciate your directness, and I hope you'll allow me to be equally frank. I understand that my presence here is unusual, but I assure you that my professional reputation has been built on my ability to conduct myself with absolute propriety while pursuing my journalistic duties. My father would hardly have sent me into a situation that might compromise either my safety or my reputation." "Of course not, and I must say your credentials are impressive. The Herald is widely respected, and your articles about the railroad negotiations showed remarkable insight into complex political matters." "Thank you. I've found that people often speak more freely to a woman, particularly about the personal costs of public policies. Men will discuss strategy and politics with their male colleagues, but it's often their wives who understand the true human impact of those decisions." The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying her with obvious interest. "An intriguing perspective. And what human stories do you hope to uncover here, Miss Whitmore?" Ellie opened her reticule and withdrew her small notebook, the gesture deliberate and professional. "I'm interested in the daily realities of frontier military life, not just the official reports of skirmishes and supply lines, but what it means for a man to serve his country in isolation from family and familiar comforts. How do soldiers maintain morale through harsh winters? What are their relationships with the local settlers? How do they view their role in the ongoing negotiations with the Indian tribes? At the mention of the tribes, Colonel Hayes's expression grew more guarded. Those are delicate matters, Miss Whitmore. The situation with the Lakota is complex. I'm sure it is, and I have no intention of oversimplifying it for popular consumption. That's precisely why I'm here, rather than simply rewriting military dispatches from the comfort of my father's office in Boston. She met his gaze steadily. I believe the American people deserve to understand the true challenges facing our military and the people of this territory. Sensationalized accounts do a disservice to everyone involved. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, and Ellie sensed she was passing some sort of test. Finally, he nodded slowly. Your father spoke highly of your discretion as well as your talent. I think we can accommodate your research, though I'll need to approve any interviews with my officers. And there are certain topics that must remain confidential for security reasons. Naturally, I would expect nothing less. Excellent. Colonel Hayes rose and moved to a cabinet behind his desk. Now, let me offer you some refreshment. We may be on the frontier, but we try to maintain certain civilized standards. He produced a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses. Unless you'd prefer tea, I can have my orderly prepare some. Brandy would be lovely, thank you. Ellie accepted the glass he offered, noting the quality of both the liquor and the crystal. You've managed to create quite an oasis of refinement here, Colonel. One does what one can to maintain morale. He settled back into his chair and raised his glass. To your success, Miss Whitmore. May your articles serve to bridge the gap between the frontier and the civilization we serve. To truth and understanding, she replied, touching her glass to his. The brandy was excellent, warming her throat and settling her nerves. As the colonel began explaining the fort's daily routine and introducing the names of officers she would meet, Ellie felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly the opportunity she had dreamed of, a chance to tell stories that mattered, to illuminate the complexities of American expansion and the people who made it possible. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Enter, Colonel Hayes called. Private Mitchell appeared, looking slightly breathless. Begging your pardon, sir, but the ladies' accommodations are ready, and Lieutenant Morrison requests permission to pay his respects. Of course, send him in. Lieutenant Morrison proved to be a man of about 30, with intelligent gray eyes and the lean build of a career cavalry officer. He removed his hat as he entered and bowed formally to Ellie. Ms. Whitmore, this is indeed an honor. Your article about the corruption in the railroad contracts was masterful. You managed to explain the financial intricacies in terms that any reader could understand while still maintaining the sophistication that the subject demanded. Ellie felt a flush of pleasure at the praise. Lieutenant Morrison, how kind of you to say so. I find that complex subjects often become clearer when one focuses on their human impact rather than getting lost in technical details. Precisely my thought. I've been hoping to discuss with you some of the challenges we face in supply procurement. The waste and inefficiency would shock Eastern taxpayers, but the reasons behind it are more complicated than simple corruption. I would be very interested in that conversation. Ellie made a note in her journal. Perhaps we could arrange a time when your duties permit? I would be delighted. The lieutenant's enthusiasm was evident. And Colonel, if I may suggest, Miss Whitmore might find it instructive to observe the evening retreat ceremony. It demonstrates the discipline and precision that maintains order in this remote location. Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly. An excellent suggestion. Miss Whitmore, would you care to join us for the ceremony, followed by dinner with the officers? I think you'll find my men both informative and entertaining company. I would be honored. Ellie closed her notebook and smoothed her skirts as she rose. Gentlemen, I must say that your warm welcome has far exceeded my expectations. I had feared that my arrival might be viewed as an intrusion. On the contrary, Lieutenant Morrison said with obvious sincerity, your presence is a reminder of the civilization we serve to protect. It's been far too long since we've had the pleasure of intelligent conversation with someone from the world beyond these walls. As they prepared to leave the colonel's quarters, Ellie reflected on the success of her first hours at Fort Lincoln. The officers were treating her with respect and genuine interest. Her credentials had opened doors that might have remained closed to a less established journalist. and she could already sense the wealth of stories waiting to be discovered. The prairie wind greeted them as they stepped onto the porch, carrying with it the vast loneliness of the frontier and the promise of adventures yet to come. Ellie pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and lifted her face to the endless sky, feeling more alive and purposeful than she had in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to meet them. This was her moment, her chance to prove that a woman could chronicle the American frontier with all the authority and insight that such an important story demanded. As the bugle began to sound retreat across the parade ground, Eleanor Whitmore took her first confident steps toward the destiny she had traveled so far to claim. Chapter 2: First Encounters. The conference room had been transformed into something resembling a formal meeting space, though the rough-hewn log walls and simple wooden furniture reminded Ellie that she was far from the marble halls of Washington. Maps of the Dakota Territory covered one wall, their boundaries marked in different colored inks that told the story of an ever-changing frontier. She positioned herself in the corner with her notebook and pen, grateful for Colonel Hayes's permission to observe the proceedings. The delegation should arrive within the hour, Lieutenant Morrison informed her, adjusting his dress uniform with nervous precision. These negotiations have been months in the making. Ellie dipped her pen and made a careful note about the preparations she witnessed. The attention to protocol impressed her. Even here in the wilderness, these men understood the importance of ceremony and respect in diplomatic affairs. She had expected frontier officers to be rough around the edges, but Colonel Hayes's command clearly maintained standards that would be acceptable in any Eastern capital. "What exactly will be discussed today?" she asked, looking up from her writing. "Mostly matters of boundaries and hunting rights," the lieutenant replied. "There have been some misunderstandings about which areas are open to settlers and which remain tribal lands. Nothing dramatic, you understand, but these details matter greatly to all parties involved." The careful way he spoke told Ellie that the situation was more complex than he was letting on, but she simply nodded and returned to her notes. She would observe first and ask probing questions later, when she had a better sense of the personalities and politics involved. The sound of horses approaching drew everyone's attention to the windows. Through the glass, Ellie could see a small group of riders entering the fort's main gate. 3 were clearly military escorts, but the other 2 were different. One, an older man with gray-streaked hair wearing a mixture of traditional and European clothing, and another whose appearance made her breath catch unexpectedly. The younger man sat his horse with unconscious grace, his long black hair catching the afternoon sunlight. Even from a distance, something about his bearing commanded attention. Not the rigid military posture of the soldiers, but a different kind of dignity altogether. "That would be Chief Standing Bear and his nephew," Lieutenant Morrison said, following her gaze. "The nephew serves as translator. He's quite educated, spent several years at a mission school." Ellie found herself watching as the younger man dismounted, his movements fluid and controlled. When he turned toward the building, she caught a glimpse of strong features and intelligent dark eyes before he disappeared from view. "Has he participated in these negotiations before?" she asked, pen poised over her notebook. "Several times. He's proven quite capable. Speaks English better than many white men I know, and he has a gift for explaining complex concepts in terms both sides can understand." Within minutes, Colonel Hayes was escorting the delegation into the conference room. Ellie straightened in her chair, pen ready, determined to capture every nuance of what promised to be a fascinating glimpse into frontier diplomacy. Chief Standing Bear entered first, his weathered face grave but not unfriendly. He wore a beaded shirt over dark trousers with a single eagle feather in his hair and traditional moccasins that moved soundlessly across the wooden floor. Despite his concessions to European dress, everything about him spoke of a man comfortable with authority and accustomed to respect. The translator followed, and Ellie felt her professional objectivity waver slightly. Up close, he was even more striking than she had expected. Tall and lean, with the kind of aristocratic features that would have turned heads in any Boston drawing room, yet there was something essentially untamed about him that no amount of civilization could completely mask. He wore dark wool trousers and a white cotton shirt, but over it was a vest of exquisite beadwork that spoke of his heritage. Gentlemen, Colonel Hayes began formally, may I present Ms. Eleanor Whitmore of the Boston Herald. Ms. Whitmore, this is Chief Standing Bearer of the Lakota and his nephew Thomas Crowfeather, who will be serving as translator for today's proceedings. The chief nodded solemnly in her direction, but it was Thomas who stepped forward with a slight bow that managed to be both respectful and natural. Miss Whitmore, it is an honor to meet you. Your reputation as a journalist has reached even our remote corners of the territory. His voice was cultured, with only the slightest trace of an accent that she couldn't quite place. The formal words were perfectly chosen, but there was something in his dark eyes, a measuring quality that made her feel as though she were being evaluated. Even as she studied him, Mr. Crowfeather, the pleasure is mine. I hope my presence won't interfere with your important work here today. Not at all. In fact, I believe accurate reporting of these proceedings serves everyone's interests. He moved to assist his uncle to a chair, the gesture both respectful and protective. Too often, misunderstandings arise from incomplete information. As the men settled around the conference table, Ellie found herself watching Thomas more than taking notes. There was something compelling about the way he moved between worlds. Speaking English with perfect grammar while communicating with his uncle in what she assumed was Lakota, adjusting his posture and mannerisms subtly depending on whom he was addressing, Colonel Hayes spread several maps across the table's surface. As we discussed in our previous meeting, there seems to be some confusion about the boundaries established in the Fort Laramie Treaty. Thomas translated for his uncle, the flowing syllables of Lakota, a marked contrast to the clipped military English that had preceded them. Chief Standing Bear responded at length, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. My uncle says that the boundaries were clearly understood by all parties at the time of the treaty, Thomas translated. However, the recent survey markers appear to be placed differently than what was agreed upon. He wishes to know if this was done deliberately or if there has been some error in measurement. Lieutenant Morrison leaned forward, pointing to specific areas on the map. The surveyors followed the technical descriptions in the treaty documents exactly. If there's a discrepancy, it may be due to differences in how geographical features were interpreted. Ellie watched Thomas's face as he listened, noting the way his expression remained carefully neutral while his eyes took in every detail. When he translated the lieutenant's words, she noticed that he spoke longer in Lakota than the original English had been, clearly adding context or explanation that helped his uncle understand the technical aspects. Mr. Crowfeather, she said during a pause in the proceedings, might I ask how you came to serve in this capacity? Your facility with both languages is remarkable. Thomas turned his attention to her fully for the first time, and she felt the impact of his direct gaze. I was fortunate to receive education at a mission school when I was young. The teachers there believed that understanding both cultures would allow me to serve as a bridge between them. And do you find that role fulfilling? She made a note in her journal, though she was more interested in his expression than his words. Fulfilling? He considered the question seriously. It is necessary. Whether it is fulfilling depends largely on whether both sides are genuinely committed to understanding rather than simply winning. There was something in his tone that made her look up from her writing. You sound as though you've had reason to doubt that commitment. Miss Whitmore, Colonel Hayes interrupted before Thomas could respond. Perhaps we should focus on today's specific agenda items. But Thomas held her gaze for another moment, and she saw something there, a intelligence and perhaps a loneliness that she hadn't expected. Here was a man who truly did walk between two worlds, and she suspected that meant he fully belonged to neither. The negotiations continued for the better part of 2 hours, covering details about hunting rights, trading posts, and the movement of both tribal groups and settlers through disputed areas. Ellie took careful notes, but found herself increasingly fascinated by the dynamics she was witnessing. Thomas was clearly more than just a translator. His uncle deferred to his judgment on several technical points, and even the military officers seemed to respect his opinions. When a particularly complex legal issue arose regarding mineral rights, Thomas didn't simply translate, he explained the concept in terms that bridged both legal traditions, drawing parallels between Lakota customs and American law that helped everyone understand the implication. "You have an unusual grasp of legal principles, Mr. Crowfeather," she observed during another break in the proceedings. "Survival requires understanding the rules by which others play the game," he replied simply. "And what game are we playing here today?" Thomas glanced toward his uncle, then back at her, and for a moment his carefully maintained diplomatic mask slipped slightly. "The same game that has been played since the first Europeans set foot on this continent, Miss Whitmore. The question is whether it will be played with honor by both sides." Before she could ask him to elaborate, Chief Standing Bear spoke quietly in Lakota. Thomas nodded and turned back to the table. "My uncle wishes to address the issue of the trading post licenses. He has concerns about some of the men who have been granted permission to establish businesses near our lands." What followed was a delicate discussion about the character and practices of various traders, during which Ellie began to understand the complexity of the relationships Thomas navigated daily. He had to translate not just words, but concepts, cultural assumptions, and sometimes uncomfortable truths that neither side particularly wanted to hear. When Chief Standing Bear described his concerns about traders who sold liquor to young men against tribal law, Thomas presented the complaint in terms that emphasized the chief's authority and desire for order rather than making accusations about specific individuals. When Colonel Hayes explained military regulations that seemed to favor settlers over tribal interests, Thomas found ways to convey the practical realities without making his uncle feel that the negotiations were pointless. "You're quite skilled at finding diplomatic language for difficult truths," Ellie said quietly during a moment when the colonel and lieutenant were conferring over a map. Thomas looked at her with what might have been surprise. "You've been listening carefully." "It's my profession to listen carefully, and to recognize when someone is working very hard to make communication possible between people who don't necessarily want to understand each other." "That's a perceptive observation." He paused, then added, "Not many people notice the work that goes into translation, beyond the words themselves. I imagine it's rather like being a journalist. You have to understand not just what people say, but what they mean and what they need to hear in order to move forward constructively." For the first time since the negotiations began, Thomas smiled, and the expression transformed his face completely. "I hadn't thought of the comparison, but you're quite right. Both professions require a certain amount of creative interpretation, and both require walking a careful line between truth and diplomacy." Indeed. His dark eyes held hers for a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "I suspect you understand that balance better than most journalists." The negotiations concluded with agreements on several minor issues and plans for future meetings to address the more complex problems. As the men shook hands and made their farewells, Ellie found herself hoping that she would have another opportunity to speak with Thomas. There were questions she wanted to ask, stories she sensed lay beneath the surface of his carefully controlled exterior. As the delegation prepared to leave, Thomas approached her chair. "Ms. Whitmore, if I may ask, what do you plan to write about today's proceedings?" She closed her notebook and considered her response carefully. "I think I'll focus on the importance of skilled translation in frontier diplomacy. Too often, Eastern readers assume that communication barriers are simply a matter of language, when in reality they involve entire worldviews that must be bridged." Thomas nodded slowly. "That would be refreshing. Most newspaper accounts focus on conflicts and disagreements rather than the work that goes into preventing them." "Conflict makes for more dramatic headlines," Ellie admitted. "But I believe my readers are more intelligent than most editors assume. They're capable of appreciating the complexity of these situations if it's presented clearly." "I hope you're right." He hesitated, then said, "If you have questions about the cultural aspects of today's discussions, I would be willing to provide additional context. My uncle and I will be in the area for several more days." Ellie felt a flutter of anticipation that was entirely professional, she told herself firmly. "That's very generous of you. I confess, I would appreciate the opportunity to better understand the Lakota perspective on these negotiations. Then perhaps we can arrange a time that would be convenient for you. I would like that very much. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Crowfeather, and thank you for the fascinating glimpse into your work today. He bowed slightly, that same natural gesture that seemed to blend respect with innate dignity. The pleasure was mine, Miss Whitmore. I looked forward to our conversation. As Thomas rejoined his uncle and they left the conference room, Ellie realized that she had learned far more today than she had expected. Not just about frontier diplomacy or treaty negotiations, but about the kind of person it took to bridge the enormous gaps between cultures that barely understood each other. She gathered her materials and prepared to return to her quarters, already composing the opening paragraphs of her article in her mind. But underneath her professional excitement lay something else, a curiosity about Thomas Crowfeather that went beyond his role as a source for her story. There was intelligence in his dark eyes and a complexity that suggested depths she had only begun to glimpse. For the first time since arriving at Fort Lincoln, Ellie found herself thinking about something other than her career and her ambitions. She found herself wondering what it would be like to truly understand the man who walked so gracefully between two worlds, belonging fully to neither but serving both with obvious dedication. It was a dangerous thought for a woman who had built her life around professional goals and rational planning. But as she walked across the parade ground toward her quarters, Eleanor Whitmore admitted to herself that Thomas Crowfeather had captured her attention in a way that had nothing to do with journalism and everything to do with the unexpected recognition of a kindred spirit in an unlikely place. Chapter 3. Unexpected Attraction. Eleanor stepped onto the fort's wooden walkway, her notebook clutched against her chest as she searched the morning bustle for any sign of Thomas. They had arranged to meet after the morning drills, and she found herself anticipating their conversation with an eagerness that had little to do with professional duty. The crisp October air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of horses being exercised in the paddock beyond the walls. Miss Whitmore? The familiar voice came from behind her, and she turned to find Thomas approaching from the direction of the stables. He had shed the formal attire of yesterday's negotiations in favor of buckskin trousers and a simple white shirt, though he still wore the beautifully beaded vest that marked his heritage. In the morning light, she could see the intricate patterns more clearly. Geometric designs in deep blues and warm reds that spoke of hours of careful craftsmanship. Mr. Crowfeather, good morning. She was pleased that her voice sounded appropriately professional, despite the quickening of her pulse. I hope I haven't kept you from more pressing duties. Not at all. I was merely ensuring that our horses were properly cared for. He gestured toward the gate. I thought you might find it instructive to see something of the territory beyond these walls. The prairie tells its own stories, if one knows how to listen. Ellie felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with propriety-conscious hesitation. A walk beyond the fort's protective walls with a man she barely knew would raise eyebrows in Boston society, but she reminded herself that frontier life required different standards. Besides, this was research, she told herself firmly. That sounds fascinating, I confess. I've seen little of the landscape beyond what was visible from the stagecoach windows. Thomas nodded toward Private Mitchell, who was standing guard duty nearby. With the private's permission, of course. We won't venture far from the fort. Private Mitchell straightened with obvious pleasure at being consulted. Of course, sir. Miss Whitmore, you'll find Mr. Crowfeather knows this country better than most. You'll be quite safe. As they walked through the main gate, Ellie found herself stealing glances at her companion. In the formal setting of yesterday's negotiations, Thomas had seemed controlled and diplomatic. Here, moving with easy familiarity across the prairie grass, he appeared more relaxed, more himself somehow. You mentioned that the prairie tells stories, she said, stepping carefully around a cluster of prickly pear cactus. What do you mean by that? Thomas paused beside a slight rise in the ground and knelt to examine something she couldn't see. Every mark on the land has meaning, if you understand the language. This depression, for instance, he pointed to what appeared to be nothing more than a shallow dip in the earth. Buffalo wallow. The herd that made this was here perhaps 2 weeks ago, moving south toward winter grazing. Ellie knelt beside him, genuinely intrigued. How can you possibly determine that? The grass is beginning to recover, but see how it's still pressed down in the center? And here. He indicated tiny hoofprints, barely visible in a patch of softer earth. The tracks haven't been completely erased by wind and weather, but they're fading. In another week, they'll be gone entirely. She made a note in her journal, fascinated by this glimpse into knowledge she had never imagined. What else can you read in the landscape? Thomas rose and offered his hand to help her to her feet. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her gloved fingers, and she noticed that he seemed reluctant to release her hand immediately. Many things. The plants tell us about water sources, soil quality, what animals pass through regularly. The way the grass bends shows prevailing wind patterns. Even the placement of prairie dog towns follows patterns that speak of underground water and soil conditions. They resumed walking, and Ellie found herself seeing the seemingly empty grassland with new eyes. What had appeared monotonous now revealed subtle variations in color and texture, patterns that hinted at the complex ecosystem Thomas was describing. In my culture, he continued, children learn to read these signs before they can read written words. It's a matter of survival, knowing where to find water, which areas provide the best hunting, where storms are likely to strike. That's remarkable. I've always prided myself on being observant, but I realized yesterday that I see only the surface of things here. She gestured toward the endless expanse of grass and sky. To me, this looks like an empty wilderness, but you're describing a library of information. Not empty at all, merely written in a language you haven't learned yet. Thomas stopped beside a cluster of tall sunflowers, their golden heads nodding in the breeze. My uncle would say that the land speaks to those who take time to listen. And what is it saying today? Thomas was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. The autumn is deepening, the grass is preparing for winter's sleep, and the animals are moving toward shelter. There's change coming. I can feel it in the wind. Something in his tone made Ellie look at him more closely. What kind of change? I'm not certain, but nothing stays the same forever, Miss Whitmore. Not even in places that seem timeless. They had reached a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves already touched with gold. Thomas gestured toward a fallen log beside the water. Perhaps we could rest here. I'd be happy to answer your questions about yesterday's negotiations. Ellie arranged her skirts carefully as she settled on the log, acutely aware of the impropriety of being alone with a man in such an isolated setting. Yet something about Thomas's presence felt safe rather than threatening. There was a gentleness in his manner that put her at ease, even as his proximity made her pulse quicken. I've been thinking about your role in those discussions, she began, opening her notebook. You're clearly more than just a translator. The officers defer to your judgment, and your uncle seems to rely on your counsel. Translation requires more than converting words from one language to another, Thomas replied, settling on a nearby boulder. Sometimes concepts don't exist in both languages, or they carry different meanings in different cultures. My job is to help both sides understand not just what is being said, but what is meant. That must be enormously challenging. And lonely. The observation seemed to surprise him. Lonely? To always be the bridge between two groups, never quite belonging fully to either. Ellie found herself speaking more personally than she had intended. I imagine it must be difficult to always be the one responsible for making others understand each other. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. I hadn't expected such insight from someone who's been here only 2 days. Perhaps it takes an outsider to recognize another outsider. The words slipped out before she could stop them, revealing more about her own feelings than she had meant to share. Are you an outsider, Miss Whitmore? You seemed quite at home with the officers yesterday. Ellie considered how to answer honestly without revealing too much. I've spent my life trying to prove that a woman can succeed in a man's profession. That requires a certain amount of careful positioning. I'm accepted, but always as an exception rather than as a natural part of the world I work in. Ah, Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, I understand that feeling. to be valued for your usefulness while remaining fundamentally different from those around you. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Ellie felt a moment of perfect understanding pass between them. Here was someone who truly comprehended the exhausting work of constantly adapting oneself to fit into spaces where one didn't naturally belong. "Tell me about your education," she said, partly to break the intensity of the moment and partly because she was genuinely curious. "The mission school you mentioned, what was that like?" Thomas picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his hands. "Strange. Wonderful. Difficult. I was 7 when my mother sent me there, convinced that understanding the white man's ways would help our people survive what was coming. That must have been frightening for a child." "Terrifying," he admitted with a slight smile. "I spoke no English, knew nothing of their customs or beliefs. The teachers were kind, mostly, but they were determined to remake me into something I wasn't. They cut my hair, made me wear their clothes, forbade me to speak Lakota, even with other Indian children." Ellie felt a pang of sympathy at the image of a young boy stripped of everything familiar. "How did you bear it?" "I learned to live in 2 worlds simultaneously. During the day, I was Takoda. I learned to read and write, studied mathematics and history, memorized Bible verses. At night, in my dreams, I was still Takoda, riding across the prairie with my father, listening to my grandmother's stories. Takoda, my birth name. It means friend to all." He tossed the stone into the creek, where it disappeared with a soft splash. "Perhaps my grandmother was prophetic, though I sometimes wonder if being everyone's friend means being no one's true companion." The note of sadness in his voice touched something deep in Ellie's chest. "Do you regret the education? The time away from your people?" "No," he said after a pause. "It gave me tools that I can use to help my uncle navigate negotiations like yesterday's. But there are times when I feel caught between worlds, too educated for some of my people to fully trust, too Indian for whites to accept completely. Yet you seem to have found a way to be valuable to both sides. Value, yes, but acceptance? True belonging?" Thomas shook his head. "That's rarer." Ellie found herself wanting to offer comfort, though she wasn't sure what form it should take. "I think true belonging is rarer than most people realize, regardless of their circumstances. I've spent my entire life in the same society I was born into, yet I often feel like I'm playing a role rather than simply being myself." "What role are you playing, Ms. Whitmore?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "The proper lady journalist, I suppose, competent enough to be taken seriously, but not so ambitious as to threaten male colleagues. Intelligent, but not intimidating. Independent, but still appropriately feminine." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." The admission surprised her with its honesty. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to simply be myself, without all the careful calculations about how others will perceive each word and action." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intent on her face. "And who would you be if you could set aside all those calculations?" The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything that had been said before. Ellie felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized that she wanted to answer honestly, wanted to share with this man truths she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "I think I would be someone who asked more dangerous questions," she said slowly. "Someone who wrote about things that mattered, even if they weren't popular or profitable. Someone who cared more about truth than acceptance." "You say that as though such a person would be unacceptable." "In my world, she probably would be. Women are expected to be interested in fashion and society gossip, not political complexities or social injustices." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "In my culture, we have stories about people who see truths that others cannot or will not see. They're often lonely figures because truth can be uncomfortable, but they're also essential. They help the tribe understand what it might otherwise miss." "That's a beautiful way to think about it." "Perhaps you're one of those truth seers, Ms. Whitmore. Perhaps that's why you feel like an outsider, because you see things others choose to ignore." The suggestion sent a warm glow through Ellie's chest. To have her deepest aspirations recognized and valued by someone who barely knew her felt like an unexpected gift. "What about you?" she asked. "If you could set aside the careful diplomacy, who would you be?" Tamas smiled, and again she was struck by how the expression transformed his face. "Someone who told the old stories without worrying about whether they would offend Christian sensibilities. Someone who could speak freely about what my people are losing as the world changes around us." "What kinds of stories?" "Creation stories, tales of heroes and tricksters and spirits that live in the land. Stories about the time before horses, when we followed the buffalo on foot. Legends about great chiefs and wise women and the prophecies they left behind." Ellie leaned forward, captivated. "Those sound fascinating. Why do they offend Christian sensibilities?" "Because they speak of different ways of understanding the divine, different relationships with the natural world. The missionaries taught that such stories were pagan superstitions that led souls away from salvation. But surely they're part of your cultural heritage? Even if one doesn't believe them literally, they must contain wisdom about how your people understood their place in the world." Thomas looked at her with something approaching surprise. "Most white people dismiss them as primitive fantasies." "Then most white people are missing something valuable." Ellie spoke with conviction born of genuine interest. "Every culture's stories contain insights into human nature and our relationship with the world around us. To dismiss them is to impoverish our understanding of the human experience." "You truly believe that?" "I do. In fact, I think those stories might be exactly the kind of truth that deserves to be preserved and shared, even if, especially if, they challenge conventional thinking." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small space between them. Ellie felt as though something significant was happening, though she couldn't quite name what it was. There was a connection forming between them that went beyond their roles as journalist and source, something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, and Thomas rose from his boulder with obvious reluctance. "We should return to the fort. Your absence will be noticed soon." Ellie gathered her notebook and allowed him to help her to her feet, again noticing the warmth of his touch through her gloves. As they began the walk back across the prairie, she found herself hoping that this would not be their last private conversation. "Mr. Crowfeather," she said as they approached the fort's walls, "would you be willing to share some of those stories with me? For my articles, I mean. I think Eastern readers would benefit from understanding the richness of Lakota culture." Thomas paused just outside the main gate, his expression thoughtful. "That's a generous offer, Miss Whitmore, but such stories are sacred to my people. I would need to consider carefully how they might be shared respectfully. Of course, I wouldn't want to trivialize or misrepresent anything important to your culture." "I believe you wouldn't," he said quietly. "Perhaps we can find a way to share some of the wisdom without violating the sacred trust." As they passed through the gate and returned to the bustling world of the fort, Ellie felt as though she was emerging from a different realm entirely. The afternoon had given her glimpses not only of the prairie's hidden complexities, but of Thomas's remarkable character. His intelligence, his gentleness, his deep connection to traditions that were foreign to her, yet somehow compelling. More than that, she had felt understood in a way that was entirely new to her. For a few precious hours, she had been able to speak honestly about her aspirations and frustrations without fear of judgment or dismissal. The experience left her both exhilarated and unsettled, aware that something had shifted between them that would be difficult to undo. As Thomas bid her farewell with a formal bow that barely concealed the warmth in his dark eyes, Eleanor Whitmore realized that her carefully planned career trajectory was about to become far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Chapter 4: Rising Star. The telegraph message arrived on a crisp November morning, delivered by Private Mitchell with a grin that suggested he already knew its contents. Ellie accepted the yellow paper with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from excitement or apprehension she couldn't say. 3 weeks had passed since she'd sent her first article about the treaty negotiations back to Boston, and she had been waiting with growing anxiety for her father's response. Article brilliant stop, reprinted, Tribune Times post-stop demand more immediately stop proud of you daughter, Stop, Father. She read the message twice before the words truly sank in. Her article had been reprinted in 3 major newspapers beyond her father's Herald: the New York Tribune, the Washington Times, and the Philadelphia Post. This was beyond her most optimistic hopes. "Good news, Miss Whitmore?" Private Mitchell inquired, barely containing his curiosity. "Very good news indeed." Ellie folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her reticule. "Thank you for bringing this so promptly." She walked across the parade ground toward the officers' quarters, her mind racing with the implications of her success. National attention for her work meant credibility, opportunities, and the kind of recognition that could establish her career permanently. More importantly, it meant that her careful, respectful portrayal of the treaty negotiations had resonated with readers across the country. "Ms. Whitmore!" Lieutenant Morrison called from the porch of the commander's office. "Colonel Hayes would like to see you at your convenience." She changed direction toward the commander's quarters, smoothing her navy blue wool dress and checking that her hair remained properly arranged beneath her small felt hat. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of cavalry drills, familiar comforts that had become part of her daily routine. Colonel Hayes rose from behind his desk as she entered, a copy of a newspaper in his hands and a broad smile creasing his weathered features. "Miss Whitmore, congratulations are in order. Your article has created quite a stir in Washington." "Thank you, Colonel. I confess I'm somewhat overwhelmed by the response." "Don't be modest. You've accomplished something remarkable here." He gestured for her to take a seat and moved around the desk to lean against its edge. "I've received communications from 3 different government officials praising your balanced portrayal of frontier diplomacy. Secretary of War Belknap himself sent a personal note expressing appreciation for your thoughtful analysis of complex territorial issues." Ellie felt a rush of satisfaction that went far beyond professional pride. "I'm gratified that the article was well received. I tried very hard to present all perspectives fairly." "Indeed you did, and it shows. Too many Eastern journalists come west looking for sensational stories about savage Indians and brave cavalry soldiers. You wrote about human beings trying to solve difficult problems with dignity and mutual respect." "Because that's what I observed, Colonel. The negotiations were conducted with remarkable professionalism by all parties involved." Colonel Hayes returned to his chair and picked up another document from his desk. "Speaking of which, I have a request that I think will interest you. Chief Standing Bear and his nephew have agreed to an extended stay in the area to work on several treaty implementation details. Young Crowfeather, in particular, has proven invaluable in helping us understand the practical implications of various provisions." Ellie felt her pulse quicken at the mention of Thomas, though she hoped her expression remained professionally neutral. "That's excellent news for the success of the negotiations." "Indeed, and I was hoping you might be willing to conduct additional interviews with both men. Your first article has generated requests for more information about tribal perspectives on territorial development. Several newspaper editors have specifically asked for follow-up pieces." "I would be honored to continue that work." The words came out more quickly than she had intended, betraying her eagerness. "Excellent. I'll arrange for you to have regular access to both Chief Standing Bear and Mr. Crowfeather. I trust you'll continue to handle these interviews with the same discretion and fairness you've already demonstrated." As Ellie walked back toward her quarters, she found herself anticipating the evening's activities with more enthusiasm than professional interest alone could account for. Over the past 3 weeks, her interactions with Thomas had evolved from formal interviews into something that resembled friendship, though she was beginning to suspect that her feelings ran deeper than simple camaraderie. Their conversations had become a highlight of her days at Fort Lincoln. Thomas possessed a quick intelligence and a depth of knowledge that made every discussion fascinating, whether they were talking about Lakota customs, frontier politics, or books they had both read. More than that, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, treating her as an intellectual equal in a way that was both refreshing and dangerously appealing. That evening, as had become their custom, they met for a walk around the fort's perimeter. The November air carried a sharp bite that spoke of winter's approach, and Ellie had wrapped her warmest shawl around her shoulders. Thomas appeared at the appointed time, wearing a heavy wool coat over his usual combination of buckskin and cotton, the beaded vest that had become familiar to her visible beneath the open front. Good evening, Miss Whitmore. I hear congratulations are in order. His formal greeting couldn't quite mask the warmth in his dark eyes, and Ellie felt the familiar flutter of pleasure at seeing him. Thank you. I must confess the response has been more positive than I dared hope. You deserve the recognition. Your article captured truths that are rarely acknowledged in public discourse about territorial negotiations. They began their usual circuit around the fort's interior walls, their pace leisurely despite the cold. This had become their compromise between propriety and the desire for private conversation, walking in full view of anyone who cared to observe, but far enough from others to speak freely. I received an interesting letter today, Ellie said, withdrawing a folded paper from her reticule, from a professor at Harvard who specializes in anthropological studies. He's requesting permission to correspond with me about your cultural observations. Thomas paused in his walking, his expression growing more serious. What kind of observations? He's particularly interested in your comments about the differences between Lakota and European concepts of land ownership. He called your explanation remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal academic training. Ellie couldn't keep a note of indignation from her voice, as though formal academic training were the only path to sophisticated thinking. You're offended on my behalf. I'm offended by the assumption that wisdom can only be gained in university lecture halls. Some of the most insightful people I've known had no formal education at all. Thomas resumed walking, but she noticed a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And yet your own formal education is clearly important to your work. Of course it is. But education comes in many forms. Your understanding of human nature, of cultural differences, of practical diplomacy. Where did you learn those things? Not in any classroom. From my grandmother, mostly. She was a storyteller and a keeper of traditional wisdom. She taught me that truth has many faces, and that wisdom lies in learning to see beyond the surface of things. I would have liked to meet her. She would have liked you, I think. She always said that the most dangerous people were those who stopped asking questions, and that the most valuable were those who asked questions others were afraid to voice. They had reached the corner of the compound where the evening light slanted through the wooden posts of the palisade, creating patterns of shadow and golden illumination. Ellie found herself studying Thomas's profile as he spoke, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his dark hair caught the light. What questions am I asking that others are afraid to voice? She asked. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her fully. You're asking whether it's possible for people from different worlds to understand each other as equals, rather than as curiosities or threats. You're asking whether respect can bridge differences that seem insurmountable. The intensity of his gaze made her heart skip, but she held his eyes steadily. What do you think the answer is? I think the answer depends entirely on the individuals involved. Some people are capable of seeing past their own assumptions, others aren't. Which category do I fall into? You? You're one of the few people I've met who seems genuinely interested in understanding, rather than simply confirming what you already believe. The compliment sent warmth spreading through her chest, though she tried to maintain her composure. That's very kind of you to say. It's not kindness, it's observation. You ask thoughtful questions and actually listen to the answers. You change your mind when presented with new information. Those are rare qualities. They resumed their walk, but the conversation had taken on a more personal tone that made Ellie acutely aware of Thomas's presence beside her. When their hands accidentally brushed as they navigated around a supply wagon, she felt the contact like a small electric shock. Tell me about your grandmother's stories, she said, partly to distract herself from the growing awareness of how much she enjoyed his company. The ones you mentioned before? Thomas was quiet for a moment, as though considering how much to share. She told stories about the time before the world changed, when the buffalo covered the plains like a dark sea and our people moved freely across the land, but also stories about change itself, about how the world has always been in motion and how survival depends on learning to adapt while holding fast to what matters most. What matters most? Honor? Truth? The bonds between people who care for each other. He glanced at her sideways. Family, whether born or chosen. Chosen family? The people who become important to you not because of blood, but because of understanding, connection, shared purpose. His voice grew quieter. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships develop between people who come from entirely different worlds. Ellie felt her breath catch at the implication in his words. That must create complicated loyalties. Very complicated, especially when those different worlds are sometimes in conflict with each other. They had reached the area near the stables, where the sounds of horses and the soft voices of soldiers tending the animals created a pocket of relative privacy. Ellie found herself wishing they could continue walking indefinitely, putting off the moment when propriety would require them to part ways for the evening. "Thomas," she said, then stopped, surprised by her use of his first name. "I'm sorry, I meant Mr. Crowfeather." "Thomas is fine," he said quietly. "When we're alone like this, formal titles seem unnecessary." The permission to use his given name felt like a gift, an acknowledgement of the friendship that had developed between them. "Thomas, then, I wanted to ask you something, though I'm not sure how to phrase it delicately." "Ask directly. I prefer honesty to delicacy." Ellie gathered her courage and plunged ahead. "Do you ever regret the path that led you to become a bridge between worlds? Do you sometimes wish you could simply belong fully to one side or the other?" Thomas stopped walking and leaned against a fence post, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes. There are moments when I'm with my uncle's people and I feel the weight of my white man's education, the ways it's changed how I see traditional practices. And there are moments here at the fort when I'm reminded that no matter how well I speak English or how useful I am in negotiations, I'll always be seen as essentially different. That sounds lonely. It can be. But lately," he paused, studying her face in the gathering dusk. "Lately I've been thinking that perhaps the answer isn't to belong fully to one world or the other, but to find people who understand what it means to live between worlds." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond friendship. Ellie felt her cheeks grow warm despite the evening chill. "Ellie," Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "May I call you Ellie?" The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yes," she managed. "Ellie, I hope you know that our conversations have become very important to me, not just for professional reasons, but personally." She looked up into his dark eyes, seeing there a reflection of her own growing feelings. "They've become important to me as well." "Good." He smiled, the expression transforming his face. "Because I was hoping you might be willing to join me for dinner tomorrow evening. Not at the officers' mess, but privately. My uncle will be there as well, of course," he added quickly. "He's expressed interest in meeting the journalist who wrote so respectfully about our negotiations." The invitation sent a thrill through her even as she recognized the potential impropriety of the situation. "I would be honored to meet your uncle properly and to continue our conversations." "Excellent. I'll make the arrangements." As they walked back toward the main buildings, Ellie realized that she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her interest in Thomas had evolved far beyond professional curiosity into something that felt both thrilling and dangerous. She was a successful journalist at the height of her career, with opportunities opening before her that she had dreamed of for years. Yet increasingly the prospect of leaving Fort Lincoln, of never seeing Thomas again, seemed more daunting than any professional challenge she might face. That night, as she prepared for bed in her small but comfortable quarters, Ellie found herself staring out the window toward the guest lodge where Thomas and his uncle were staying. The building was dark, except for the faint glow of firelight in one window, and she wondered if Thomas was awake, thinking about their conversation as she was. She had come to Dakota Territory to make her reputation as a serious journalist. Instead, she was falling in love with a man whose world was so different from hers that she couldn't imagine how any relationship between them could possibly work. Yet, as she finally settled into bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to her chin against the prairie cold, Eleanor Whitmore found herself hoping desperately that she would find a way to bridge the gap between their different worlds. because losing what was developing between them seemed unthinkable, even if pursuing it might cost her everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Chapter 5: Pressure Mounts. The telegram arrived on a gray December morning, delivered with unusual urgency by a harried-looking Private Mitchell, whose expression warned Ellie that this message would bring unwelcome news. She accepted the yellow paper with steady hands, though her stomach clenched with foreboding as she recognized her father's urgent transmission style. Return Boston, immediately stop articles, causing political problems. Stop Senator Crawford threatening withdrawal advertising. Stop carry at stake, stop no choice. Stop Father Ali read the message 3 times before its full implications sank in. Senator Crawford was one of her father's most important political allies and the Herald's largest advertiser. If he was threatening to withdraw support over her articles about the treaty negotiations, it meant her careful, respectful portrayal of Lakota perspectives had been interpreted as dangerous sympathy for America's enemies. "Miss Whitmore," Private Mitchell's concerned voice penetrated her shock. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "No, thank you. Just unexpected news from home." She folded the telegram and tucked it into her reticule with hands that trembled slightly. "Is Colonel Hayes available? I need to speak with him urgently." Within the hour, she found herself seated across from the colonel's desk, watching his weathered face grow increasingly grave as he read her father's telegram. When he finished, he set the paper down carefully and leaned back in his chair. "I'm sorry to hear this, Miss Whitmore. Your work here has been exemplary, both professionally and personally." "Thank you, Colonel, but I'm afraid I don't understand why my articles would create political controversy. I was scrupulously fair in my reporting, presenting all perspectives without taking sides." Colonel Hayes picked up a newspaper from his desk and handed it across to her. "This arrived yesterday with the mail from Washington. Perhaps it will clarify the situation." The headline made her breath catch. "Herald journalist promotes savage interests. Eastern lady writer seduced by Indian propaganda." The byline belonged to Senator Crawford himself, and the article was a vicious attack on both her credibility and her patriotism. "He's accusing me of being an Indian sympathizer," she said quietly, scanning the inflammatory language, "of undermining American territorial interests for the sake of primitive sentimentality." "Senator Crawford has presidential ambitions, Miss Whitmore. Opposition to Indian treaty rights plays well with certain voter constituencies, particularly those invested in rapid territorial development." Ellie felt sick as she continued reading. Crawford had twisted her careful observations about Lakota cultural sophistication into evidence of dangerous naivety. Her respectful portrayal of Chief Standing Bear became proof of her inability to distinguish between civilized and savage peoples. Most damaging of all, he had somehow learned about her friendship with Thomas and was using it to suggest that her judgment had been compromised by inappropriate personal attachments. How could he possibly know about my conversations with Mr. Crowfeather? Colonel Hayes's expression grew uncomfortable. "I'm afraid information travels quickly in political circles, particularly when it concerns potential scandals. Your evening walks with young Crowfeather haven't gone unnoticed, despite your careful adherence to propriety." "We've done nothing improper." The words came out more sharply than she intended. "Our conversations have been entirely professional and always in full view of the fort's personnel." "I believe that, Miss Whitmore, but perception can be as damaging as reality in these matters. A young unmarried woman spending time alone with an Indian man, even one as educated and respectable as Thomas, provides ammunition for those looking to discredit your work." Ellie stared at the newspaper in her lap, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed career beginning to crumble around her. "So, my father wants me to return to Boston immediately. It appears so. And I'm afraid I have additional unwelcome news. I have received orders from Washington to limit Mr. Crowfeather's access to fort facilities and to suspend any further interviews between him and members of the press." The blow hit her like a physical force. "They're blaming Thomas for my articles? There are concerns about the appropriateness of an Indian translator having such extensive contact with journalists. Questions have been raised about his loyalty, and the possibility that he's been using his position to influence public opinion. Ellie felt a surge of protective anger on Thomas's behalf. That's absolutely ridiculous. Thomas has conducted himself with complete professionalism and integrity throughout our interactions. I agree. But my hands are tied, Miss Whitmore. Politics have a way of overriding common sense and basic fairness. She rose from her chair, clutching the damning newspaper. I need to speak with Thomas immediately. He should know what's happening before rumors reach him. Colonel Hayes nodded gravely. I'll arrange for a brief meeting, but Miss Whitmore, given the circumstances, it would be wise to keep your conversation strictly professional. Ellie found Thomas in the small cabin behind the main lodge where he had been staying with his uncle. The space was spartanly furnished, but neat, with traditional blankets folded carefully on a wooden cot, and his few possessions arranged with military precision. He rose when she entered, his expression immediately shifting to concern when he saw her face. Ellie, what's wrong? She handed him the newspaper without preamble, watching his dark eyes scan the headline and first paragraph. His expression remained carefully controlled, but she saw his jaw tighten as he read Crawford's accusations. I see, he said quietly when he finished. So our friendship has become a weapon against both of us. Thomas, I'm so sorry. I never intended for my articles to create problems for you. You have nothing to apologize for. Your writing was honest and fair, qualities that apparently make some people uncomfortable. He set the newspaper aside and looked at her directly. What does your father want you to do? Return to Boston immediately. And Colonel Hayes has received orders to limit your access to the fort and suspend any further press interviews. Thomas nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting such news. Of course they have. When truth becomes inconvenient, the messenger is always blamed. This isn't fair to you. You've done nothing but serve faithfully as a translator and cultural liaison. Fairness has little to do with politics, Ellie. You should know that by now. His voice was gentle but resigned. The question is, what you're going to do. Ellie had been dreading this moment since reading her father's telegram. I don't have much choice. My father controls my position at the Herald, and without his support, no other newspaper will hire me. If I refuse to return to Boston, I'll be throwing away everything I've worked for. And if you do return? The question hung between them, loaded with implications they had both been avoiding. If I return, we probably won't see each other again. Thomas moved closer, his dark eyes searching her face. Is that what you want? No, she whispered, the admission torn from her heart. But I don't see any alternative. My career, my independence, my ability to support myself, everything depends on maintaining my father's backing. I understand. His voice was steady, but she could see the pain he was trying to hide. You've worked too hard to sacrifice everything for a relationship that was always unlikely to succeed. Don't say that. Tears were threatening now, despite her efforts to maintain composure. What we have isn't unlikely, it's real, but the world we live in makes it impossible. Thomas reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her best efforts. The world we live in makes many good things impossible, Ellie. That doesn't make them less valuable for the brief time we can hold them. The tenderness in his touch and voice nearly undid her completely. I don't want to lose you. You won't lose me. What we've shared, our conversations, our understanding of each other, that will always be part of who you are. Distance can't erase the connection we've discovered. A knock at the door interrupted their painful conversation. Chief Standing Bear entered, his weathered face grave as he spoke rapidly in Lakota to his nephew. Thomas replied in the same language, their exchange growing increasingly intense. What's he saying? Ellie asked when they paused. Thomas turned back to her with obvious reluctance. He's heard rumors from some of the young warriors that I've been spending too much time with white people and neglecting my duties to our people. There are questions being raised about my loyalty on both sides now. Because of our friendship, partly, but also because of the positions I've taken in negotiations, advocating for compromise rather than confrontation. Some of the younger men believe that any cooperation with the military is betrayal. Chief Standing Bear spoke again, his tone urgent. Thomas listened, then translated quietly. He says that several tribal leaders are questioning my suitability to serve as translator. They're concerned that my judgment has been influenced by personal attachments. The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. Not only was her career being destroyed by their relationship, but Thomas was facing suspicion and potential rejection from his own people. The unfairness of it made her want to scream with frustration. So we're both being punished for developing a friendship based on mutual respect and understanding, she said bitterly. Welcome to the reality of living between two worlds, Thomas replied with dark humor. Sometimes both sides decide you can't be trusted. Chief Standing Bear spoke again, this time directing his words to Ellie. Thomas hesitated before translating Ethan. He says that he has great respect for you personally, but that he believes it would be best for everyone if you return to your people soon. The situation is becoming dangerous for all concerned. Ellie felt the last of her resistance crumble. Even Thomas's uncle, who had treated her with kindness and respect, was essentially telling her to leave. The message was clear. Her presence was creating problems that threatened people she had come to care about deeply. Then I suppose the decision has been made for me, she said quietly. I want you to know that these past months have been the most meaningful of my life. Whatever happens next, I will never regret the time we've had together. Nor will I. She looked up into his dark eyes, memorizing every detail of his face. But I wish things could have been different. So do I. But wishing doesn't change the world we live in. Chief Standing Bear spoke again, more gently this time. Thomas nodded and turned back to Ellie. He says that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to step away, to protect the other person from harm that your presence might cause. The wisdom in the old chief's words brought fresh tears to her eyes. He's right, isn't he? He usually is. Thomas's voice was thick with emotion he was trying to control. My uncle has seen many changes in his lifetime. He understands the cost of trying to force two incompatible worlds to merge. Another knock at the door announced Colonel Hayes' arrival. His face was sympathetic but firm as he addressed them both. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Miss Whitmore, the evening stage to Bismarck is leaving in 2 hours. If you're planning to catch tomorrow's eastbound train, you'll need to be on it. The colonel's words made everything suddenly, brutally real. In 2 hours, she would leave Fort Lincoln forever. She would return to Boston, salvage what she could of her career, and try to rebuild her life without the man who had become the most important person in her world. I understand, she managed. I'll gather my things immediately. As she turned to leave, Thomas caught her hand gently. Ellie, wait. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. I want you to have this. She unwrapped the leather to reveal a small carved stone, a horse running with its mane flowing in the wind. The workmanship was exquisite, every detail perfect despite the stone's tiny size. It's beautiful, she whispered. My grandmother made it for me when I left for the mission school. She said it would remind me that no matter how far I traveled or how much I changed, the spirit that made me who I was would always be free to run. I can't take something so precious to you. You're not taking it, I'm giving it to you. Keep it and remember that distance doesn't have to mean the end of everything. Sometimes it just means transformation. Ellie closed her fingers around the small carving, feeling its smooth warmth against her palm. Thank you for this and for everything else you've given me. Thank you for seeing me as more than just a curiosity or a political symbol. Thank you for treating my people's traditions with respect instead of dismissing them as primitive superstitions. The finality in his words made it clear that this was goodbye. Ellie looked around the small cabin one last time, trying to memorize every detail of this moment, then forced herself to walk toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back once more. Thomas stood in the center of the room, tall and dignified despite the pain she could see in his eyes. Behind him, Chief Standing Bear watched with the grave compassion of someone who had witnessed many partings and understood their necessity. "Goodbye, Thomas," she whispered. "Goodbye, Ellie. May your path lead you to happiness, wherever it takes you." As she walked across the fort's parade ground toward her quarters, Eleanor Whitmore felt as though she was leaving part of her soul behind. The small carved horse seemed to burn against her palm, a tangible reminder of what she was giving up for the sake of a career that suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. But she had no choice. The world they lived in had made its judgment clear. Love between people from different worlds was not only impossible, it was dangerous. And as much as it broke her heart to accept that reality, she couldn't allow her selfish desires to destroy the lives of others. In 2 hours, she would begin the journey back to the life she had built before coming to Dakota Territory. But she knew with absolute certainty that the woman who boarded that stage would be fundamentally different from the one who had arrived at Fort Lincoln with such grand ambitions just months before. The question was whether the person she had become would be able to survive in the world she was returning to, or whether some essential part of her would always remain here on the prairie with a man whose love she could never have. Chapter 6. The Crisis. The sound of gunfire shattered the dawn stillness, jerking Ellie from restless sleep with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been scheduled to depart on the afternoon stage, her trunks already packed and waiting beside the door. But the sharp crack of rifles somewhere beyond the fort's walls changed everything in an instant. She threw on her wrapper and rushed to the window, peering through the frost-etched glass toward the main gate. Soldiers were running across the parade ground, their blue uniforms dark against the snow that had fallen during the night. Commands rang out in the crisp air, but she couldn't make out the specific words from her quarters. A sharp knock interrupted her frantic observations. "Miss Whitmore." Private Mitchell's voice carried unusual urgency. "Colonel Hayes requests your immediate presence in his office." Ellie dressed quickly in her traveling dress, her fingers fumbling with buttons as more rifle shots echoed from beyond the fort's walls. Whatever was happening outside, the colonel's summons suggested it involved her somehow, a possibility that filled her with dread given the tensions of the previous day. She found Colonel Hayes' office in controlled chaos. Maps covered every surface, and 3 junior officers clustered around the desk while the colonel himself stood at the window, field glasses trained on something in the distance. His face was grim when he turned to acknowledge her arrival. "Miss Whitmore, I'm afraid we have a serious situation developing. Please, sit down." "Colonel, what's happening? Those gunshots." A patrol encountered a group of Lakota warriors approximately 3 miles northeast of here. Shots were exchanged, and I regret to report that there were casualties on both sides. Ellie sank into the indicated chair, her mind immediately racing to Thomas and his uncle. "How serious are the casualties?" 2 soldiers wounded, 1 seriously, and at least 1 Indian killed, possibly more. Colonel Hayes set down his field glasses and moved behind his desk. "The surviving warriors have withdrawn, but the situation remains volatile. I don't understand why you've asked me here. Surely this is a military matter." Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with Lieutenant Morrison before answering. "I'm afraid it's more complicated than that, Miss Whitmore. The patrol was acting on information about Indian movements in that area. Information that appears to have been derived from your recent articles." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, holding a folded newspaper. "Your second article, published last week, described traditional hunting patterns and seasonal migration routes. Captain Radley used those details to predict where Lakota hunting parties might be found." Ellie stared at the newspaper in horror. She remembered writing about the information Thomas had shared regarding his people's traditional territories, but she had been careful to present it as historical context, not current intelligence. "I never intended for that information to be used for military purposes." "Of course not," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "But the damage has been done. And I'm afraid there's more troubling news. Captain Bradley is claiming that his patrol was compromised, that someone had warned the Indians they were coming." "Warned them how?" That's what we're trying to determine, but the captain is suggesting that Mr. Crowfeather may have learned of the patrol's plans and somehow communicated them to the warriors they encountered. Ellie felt the room spin around her. That's impossible. Thomas would never betray military operations. His entire role here has been to promote peaceful communication between the two sides. Nevertheless, questions are being raised about his loyalties, particularly in light of the personal relationship that has developed between you two. Before Ellie could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Corporal Jenkins, his face flushed from running. "Colonel, sir, Captain Bradley's patrol is returning, and they've brought prisoners." Through the window, Ellie could see a small group of riders approaching the main gate. 3 cavalry soldiers escorted 2 figures on horseback, Indians whose hands appeared to be bound. Even from a distance, she could see that one of the prisoners was injured, slumping forward in his saddle. "Dear God," she whispered. Colonel Hayes was already moving toward the door. "Miss Whitmore, I must ask you to remain here until we can sort out this situation. The fort will be in lockdown until further notice." "Colonel, please. If there are wounded people, I might be able to help. I have some medical training." "Absolutely not. This situation is far too volatile for civilian involvement." He left her alone in the office with Lieutenant Morrison, who looked deeply uncomfortable with his assignment as her keeper. Through the window, she watched the grim procession cross the parade ground toward the guardhouse. Her heart clenched when she recognized one of the prisoners despite his injuries. It was Swift Arrow, one of the young warriors who had sometimes accompanied Thomas to the fort. "Lieutenant," she said carefully, "where are Chief Standing Bear and Thomas? Are they safe?" Morrison glanced toward the door, then back at her. "As far as we know, they weren't involved in this morning's encounter. They're still in their quarters, but..." He hesitated. "But what?" "But they're being confined there until we can determine exactly what happened. Captain Bradley is demanding a full investigation into possible intelligence leaks." Ellie closed her eyes, feeling the walls closing in around everyone she had come to care about. Her innocent articles about Lakota culture were being used as military intelligence. Thomas was under suspicion of betrayal, and young men on both sides were wounded or dead because of misunderstandings that seemed to multiply by the hour. The door opened again, admitting Captain Bradley himself. Ellie had met him only briefly during her time at the fort, a hard-faced man in his 30s with pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him as either asset or threat. His uniform was dusty and stained, and there was a bandage around his left forearm. "Ms. Whitmore," he said without preamble, "I need to ask you some questions about your conversations with the Indian translator." "Captain Bradley, I'm sorry you were injured, but I don't see how my interviews with Mr. Crowfeather could possibly be relevant to this morning's events." "Don't you?" His voice carried a sharp edge. "Let me explain what happened out there. My patrol was following intelligence about Indian hunting parties in the Beaver Creek area, intelligence derived directly from information in your published articles. We approached the area cautiously, expecting to find perhaps 3 or 4 warriors engaged in legitimate hunting." He moved closer, his pale eyes fixed on her face. "Instead, we rode into what appeared to be an organized ambush. 6 warriors, armed and positioned as though they were expecting us. Someone had warned them we were coming. That doesn't mean Thomas, Mr. Crowfeather, was involved. Perhaps your patrol was simply observed by scouts as you approached. Possible, but unlikely. We used a route that should have been undetectable to casual observation. No, Ms. Whitmore, someone with access to military planning leaked our intentions." Ellie felt anger rising to replace her initial shock. "Are you accusing me of espionage, Captain?" "Exploring all possibilities. You've had extensive private conversations with Crowfeather, conversations that occurred without military supervision. You've demonstrated clear sympathy for Indian interests in your articles, and you've had access to general information about patrol schedules through your interactions with various officers. This is outrageous. My conversations with Mr. Crowfeather were entirely professional, and I have never had access to specific military intelligence." "Haven't you?" Captain Bradley pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "According to my records, you've dined with the officers 14 times since your arrival. You've attended 3 military briefings as an observer. You've been granted unprecedented access to treaty negotiations. Are you telling me that operational matters were never discussed in your presence? Ellie realized with growing horror that her enthusiastic participation in Fort Life, her efforts to understand the complexity of frontier military operations, was now being twisted into evidence of potential espionage. General topics may have been mentioned, but never specific patrol plans or tactical details. Yet, somehow, information found its way to hostile Indians, and soldiers under my command paid the price. Lieutenant Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Captain, perhaps we should wait for Colonel Hayes before continuing this questioning. The colonel asked me to begin gathering information immediately. Bradley turned back to Ellie. Miss Whitmore, I need you to account for your whereabouts and activities during the past 48 hours. Specifically, I need to know every interaction you've had with Crowfeather or any other Indians. Ellie's mind raced as she tried to remember her recent activities. I spent most of yesterday packing and saying farewell to various officers. I had one brief conversation with Thomas Sinver, Mr. Crowfeather, in the evening, but it was purely personal in nature. Define personal. Heat flooded her cheeks. We discussed my departure and said our goodbyes. Where did this conversation take place? In his quarters, with his uncle present. Captain Bradley made a note in his book. How long did this conversation last? Perhaps 30 minutes? And what specifically was discussed? Private matters, Captain. Nothing related to military operations. I'll be the judge of that. Did Crowfeather ask about your travel plans? About when patrols might be scheduled? About which routes might be considered safe for civilian travel? No. The denial came out sharper than she intended. He asked nothing about military matters whatsoever. Yet within hours of your conversation, my patrol walked into what appears to have been a carefully planned ambush. Colonel Hayes returned at that moment, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. Captain Bradley, I thought I made it clear that any questioning of Miss Whitmore would wait until I returned. Sir, with respect, soldiers under my command are wounded and possibly dying. I felt immediate action was necessary. Your feelings are noted, Captain. Now please wait outside while I speak with Miss Whitmore privately. After Bradley's reluctant departure, Colonel Hayes sank into his chair with obvious weariness. Ms. Whitmore, I apologize for the captain's aggressive approach. He's understandably upset about the casualties among his men. Colonel, surely you don't believe these accusations. I don't want to believe them. But I'm afraid the evidence is becoming difficult to ignore. Your articles did contain detailed information about Lakota movements and territories. You have developed personal relationships with Indians who may have conflicted loyalties. And there does appear to have been some sort of intelligence leak. Ellie felt her world crumbling around her. Everything I wrote was presented as historical and cultural context, not current intelligence, and Thomas has proven his loyalty repeatedly through his service as translator. Perhaps. But Miss Whitmore, I've just received a telegram from Washington. Senator Crawford is demanding a full investigation into your activities here, and he specifically mentioned the possibility of treason charges. The word treason hit her like a physical blow. Treason? For writing respectful articles about Native American culture? For potentially providing aid and comfort to enemies of the United States? It's a serious charge, Miss Whitmore, and one that could destroy not only your career, but your freedom. A commotion outside the window drew their attention. Thomas was being escorted across the parade ground by 2 armed soldiers, his hands bound behind his back. Even from a distance, she could see the dignity with which he carried himself, despite his circumstances. Where are they taking him? To the guardhouse for questioning. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, but given the seriousness of the situation, I have no choice but to treat him as a suspect in this morning's events. Ellie rose from her chair, driven by a desperate need to do something, anything, to help the man who had become so important to her. Colonel, please, let me speak with him. If there's been some misunderstanding, perhaps I can help clarify. Absolutely not. You're both under suspicion now, and any contact between you would only fuel speculation about collusion. This is madness. Thomas and I have done nothing wrong." "Maybe not, but perception has become reality, Miss Whitmore. Your association with Crowfeather, combined with the unfortunate timing of this morning's events, has created a situation that threatens to destroy both of your reputations." Through the window, she watched Thomas disappear into the stone guardhouse, and her heart broke a little more. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from celebrated journalist to suspected traitor, and the man she loved was facing accusations of betraying his role as peacemaker. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we conduct a thorough investigation. Your departure for Boston is postponed indefinitely pending the outcome. And Miss Whitmore, I strongly advise you to consider very carefully whether there's anything you haven't told us about your relationship with Crowfeather or your knowledge of Indian activities." As Colonel Hayes's words sank in, Eleanor Whitmore realized that her carefully planned life had just exploded into fragments around her. Her career, her reputation, her freedom, and her future were all now hanging in the balance, dependent on the outcome of an investigation into events she barely understood. But worst of all, the man she had come to love was facing accusations that could cost him everything, and there was nothing she could do to help him. The very relationship that had brought meaning and joy into her life had become the weapon being used to destroy them both. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, covering the fort in a blanket of deceptive peace, while underneath, the foundations of everything she had built were cracking beyond repair. Chapter 7. Choosing Love Over Career. The inquiry commenced at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, conducted in the fort's largest room with the formal precision that military justice demanded. Ellie sat on a hard wooden chair facing a panel of 3 officers, feeling like a defendant in her own trial despite being officially classified as a witness. The morning light streaming through the windows cast harsh shadows across the assembled faces, and the air itself seemed weighted with judgment. Colonel Hayes served as presiding officer, flanked by Major Thompson from Fort Snelling and Captain Bradley, whose bandaged arm served as a visible reminder of the previous day's violence. Behind her, she could hear the shuffle of other witnesses and observers, including several newspaper correspondents who had arrived on the morning train. Her downfall, it seemed, would be as public as her brief triumph had been. "Miss Whitmore," Colonel Hayes began formally, "you are here to provide testimony regarding your interactions with the interpreter, Thomas Crowfeather, and any information that may have been shared during those interactions. You are reminded that this is an official military inquiry and that false testimony constitutes a serious offense." "I understand, Colonel." "Very well. Captain Bradley, you may proceed with your questions." Bradley rose from his seat, his pale eyes fixed on her with undisguised hostility. "Miss Whitmore, during your time at this fort, you conducted numerous interviews with the Indian known as Thomas Crowfeather. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And these interviews took place in various locations, including private settings away from military supervision?" Ellie felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "My conversations with Mr. Crowfeather were conducted with full knowledge and approval of Colonel Hayes. They were professional interviews for journalistic purposes. Professional interviews that evolved into personal walks, private dinners, and intimate conversations." "Would you characterize your relationship with Crowfeather as strictly professional?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ellie glanced toward Colonel Hayes, who nodded slightly, indicating she should answer honestly. "Mr. Crowfeather and I developed a friendship based on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility. Our conversations covered both professional and personal topics. Personal topics such as your feelings about military operations, your opinions regarding government policy toward Indians. We discussed many subjects, Captain: literature, philosophy, cultural differences." "Did you discuss military matters?" "Only in the most general terms as background for my articles." Bradley moved closer, his voice sharpening. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm going to read you a passage from your second published article." He withdrew a folded newspaper and opened it with deliberate ceremony. "The seasonal hunting patterns of the Lakota follow ancient routes established over generations. During the autumn months, hunting parties typically range northeast of Fort Lincoln toward the Beaver Creek area, where game is abundant and water sources reliable." As he read her own words back to her, Ellie felt a chill of recognition. The Beaver Creek area, exactly where Captain Bradley's patrol had encountered the warriors. Do you recognize this passage, Miss Whitmore? Yes, it's from my article about traditional Lakota culture. And where did you obtain this specific information about hunting patterns and locations? From my interviews with Mr. Crowfeather as part of his explanation of his people's traditional way of life. So you're admitting that Crowfeather provided you with detailed intelligence about current Indian movements, which you then published in a national newspaper. No! The denial burst from her with more force than she'd intended. I published historical and cultural information, not current intelligence. There's a significant difference. Is there? Because my patrol used your published information to predict where we might encounter hostile Indians, and we walked directly into what appeared to be an organized ambush. Major Thompson leaned forward. Ms. Whitmore, are you certain that your conversations with Crowfeather never touched on current tribal activities? Recent movements, planned hunts or gatherings? Ellie searched her memory carefully. Thomas had mentioned that hunting parties were beginning to move toward winter territories, but he had presented it as general seasonal information, not specific intelligence about particular groups. Mr. Crowfeather may have mentioned general seasonal patterns, but never specific details about particular hunting parties or their locations. Yet your article contained very specific geographic references, Bradley pressed, references that proved remarkably accurate when it came to predicting where armed Indians might be found. Captain, with respect, the Lakota have been hunting in these territories for generations. Their seasonal patterns are well established and could be predicted by anyone with basic knowledge of the region. Could they also predict that those hunting parties would be armed and positioned as though expecting military contact? The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Are you suggesting that I somehow warned them about your patrol? I'm suggesting that someone did. And you've admitted to having private conversations with Indians whose loyalty is questionable at best. Thomas Crowfeather's loyalty is not questionable. The words exploded from her before she could stop them. He has served faithfully as translator and mediator, working tirelessly to prevent exactly the kind of misunderstanding that occurred yesterday. Yet soldiers under my command are wounded, and one young Indian is dead. If Crowfeather was working to prevent misunderstandings, he failed spectacularly. Ellie rose from her chair, driven by a fury that overwhelmed her caution. The only failure here is the failure of men like you to see past your prejudices and recognize that Thomas Crowfeather has done more to promote peace between our peoples than any of your military operations. Ms. Whitmore, please resume your seat, Colonel Hayes said sharply. No, Colonel, I will not resume my seat while a good man's character is being assassinated by innuendo and suspicion. She turned to face the assembled observers, including the newspaper correspondents who were scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Thomas Crowfeather is a man of integrity and honor who has dedicated himself to building bridges between cultures that barely understand each other. If anyone in this room has compromised the peace, it's those who choose to see enemies where they might find allies. Miss Whitmore, you are out of order, Major Thompson said sternly. This is a military inquiry, not a platform for political speeches. Political speeches? Ellie laughed bitterly. I'm defending a man whose only crime was trying to help two sides communicate with each other. If that's political, then perhaps the problem lies with the politics, not with the man. Captain Bradley's voice was icy with controlled anger. Ms. Whitmore, your emotional attachment to the Indian translator has clearly compromised your judgment. Your testimony here today only reinforces our concerns about your suitability to report on frontier matters. My emotional attachment? She wheeled to face him directly. Yes, Captain, I am emotionally attached to the truth. I am emotionally attached to fairness and justice, and I am emotionally attached to protecting good people from the kind of witch hunt you're conducting here. The room erupted in murmurs and shocked whispers. One of the newspaper correspondents was already heading for the door, undoubtedly rushing to file his story about the lady journalist's spectacular breakdown. Ellie realized dimly that she had just destroyed her career with her own hands. But the knowledge brought surprising relief rather than regret. Furthermore, she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room, I find it deeply disturbing that this inquiry has focused more on assigning blame than on understanding what actually happened. Have any of you bothered to question whether the warriors my patrol encountered were actually hostile, or whether they were simply defending themselves against what they perceived as an attack? Ms. Whitmore, Colonel Hayes said with obvious warning in his tone, you are treading on very dangerous ground. Am I, Colonel? Because it seems to me that the dangerous ground is the assumption that any armed Indian is automatically hostile, and that any American who questions that assumption is automatically a traitor. Major Thompson stood abruptly. Miss Whitmore, your comments are approaching seditious territory. I strongly advise you to reconsider your statements. I've considered them carefully, Major, and I stand by every word. The door to the inquiry room opened suddenly, admitting a telegraph operator with a yellow message form. He handed it to Colonel Hayes, who read it quickly before looking up at Ellie with an expression of grim finality. Miss Whitmore, this telegram is from your father. He wishes me to inform you that your employment with the Boston Herald has been terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, he states that you are no longer welcome in his household and that he considers all family ties severed. The words should have devastated her, but instead, Ellie felt an odd sense of liberation. Her father's ultimatum meant the last bridge to her old life had been burned, but it also meant she was finally free to speak her mind, without worrying about the consequences. I see, she said quietly. And I suppose Senator Crawford's political influence played a role in this decision? Ms. Whitmore, I think it would be best if you return to your quarters while we consider how to proceed. Of course, Colonel. But before I go, I want to make one thing absolutely clear to everyone in this room. She looked directly at each of the panel members in turn. Thomas Crowfeather is innocent of any wrongdoing. He has served with honor and integrity, and anyone who suggests otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately malicious. Whatever consequences I may face for defending him, I accept them willingly. She walked toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster, aware that every eye in the room was following her progress. At the threshold, she turned back one final time. And gentlemen, when you write your reports about today's proceedings, I hope you'll remember that there are some things more important than careers or reputations. Truth is one of them, justice is another, and sometimes protecting the innocent requires sacrificing everything else. As she stepped outside, Ellie nearly collided with Thomas, who was standing under guard near the building's entrance. His dark eyes met hers with a mixture of anguish and admiration that made her heart clench painfully. Ellie, he said quietly, what have you done? What I had to do? You've destroyed yourself to defend me. I've finally told the truth. If that destroys me, so be it. Thomas stepped closer, ignoring the warning looks from his guards. You don't understand what you've sacrificed. Your career, your family, your entire future, all for someone who can never give you anything in return. You've given me more than you know, she replied softly. You've shown me what it means to live with integrity, even when it's difficult. You've taught me that some principles are worth any sacrifice. Ellie, please. Thomas Crowfeather, one of the guards interrupted roughly. You're needed back in the guardhouse. As the guards moved to escort him away, Thomas spoke urgently. Ellie, listen to me. What happened between us? It was a beautiful dream. But dreams don't survive in the real world. You need to find a way back to your old life, whatever it takes. There is no way back, she said simply. And I'm not sure I'd take it if there were. There has to be. I won't be responsible for destroying your future. You're not responsible for anything except showing me who I really am underneath all the careful pretense. The guards were pulling him away now, but he called back over his shoulder. Ellie, forget me. Forget everything that happened here. Build a new life somewhere else, far away from this place. She watched until he disappeared around the corner of the guardhouse, then made her way slowly back to her quarters. The fort seemed different now, hostile eyes following her progress, whispered conversations falling silent as she passed. Word of her outburst at the inquiry had obviously spread quickly. In her small room, she sat on the narrow bed and stared at her packed trunks. Everything she had brought to Dakota Territory with such high hopes now seemed to belong to a different person. A woman who had believed that success meant gaining approval from men who would never truly respect her anyway. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Mrs. Patterson, the colonel's wife, standing in the hallway with a concerned expression. "Ms. Whitmore, I heard about what happened at the inquiry. I wanted you to know that not everyone here agrees with the way you've been treated." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That's very kind. I also wanted to tell you that Mr. Crowfeather and his uncle are being released this evening. There wasn't enough evidence to hold them longer." Ellie felt a flood of relief. Thank God. Yes, but they're being escorted off the reservation immediately. Colonel Hayes felt it was the only way to defuse the situation. The relief transformed instantly into fresh anguish. "Where will they go?" "I don't know, my dear. Somewhere far from here, I imagine." After Mrs. Patterson left, Ellie sat in the gathering darkness and contemplated the ruins of her carefully planned life. Her career was gone. Her family had disowned her, and the man she loved was being banished to protect her from further association with him. Yet despite the devastation, she felt a strange peace settling over her. For the first time in her adult life, she had acted according to her conscience rather than her calculations. She had chosen love over ambition, truth over safety, and principle over profit. It might have cost her everything she thought she wanted, but it had also revealed something she had never fully understood about herself. She was stronger than she had known, braver than she had imagined, and capable of surviving the loss of things she had once thought essential. As night fell over Fort Abraham Lincoln, Eleanor Whitmore began to plan, not for a return to her former life, but for whatever new existence might be possible for a woman who had finally learned to value her integrity more than her reputation. The price had been steep, but the freedom was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Chapter 8. Alone in the Wilderness. Ellie stepped down from the freight wagon onto the frozen mud of Willow Creek's main street, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter February air. The driver deposited her 2 trunks beside her with unnecessary force, clearly eager to be rid of his troublesome passenger. Word of her disgrace had traveled ahead of her along the frontier telegraph lines, making her a pariah even in places she had never been. "There'll be $2 for the ride, miss," the driver said without meeting her eyes. She counted out the coins from her dwindling purse, watching her precious resources disappear with each transaction. The train ticket from Bismarck had consumed most of her savings, and the wagon ride from the nearest rail station had taken another substantial bite. At this rate, her remaining funds would last perhaps 2 weeks. Willow Creek stretched before her like a collection of weathered wooden boxes scattered across the prairie, its single main street lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to huddle together against the endless wind. A general store, a saloon with peeling paint, a blacksmith shop belching smoke into the gray sky, the essential elements of frontier survival reduced to their most basic forms. She had chosen this remote settlement precisely because of its isolation, hoping to disappear into anonymity while she figured out how to rebuild her shattered life. The town was too small to have its own newspaper, too insignificant to attract the attention of journalists seeking to chronicle her downfall. Here, she might have a chance to start over, without the weight of her past following every step. "You looking for someone in particular?" the driver asked grudgingly, apparently feeling some obligation to ensure she wasn't simply abandoned in the street. "I was hoping to find lodging and perhaps employment," Ellie replied, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Mrs. Sullivan runs the boarding house above the dress shop. Might have work for someone with city manners, if you ain't too proud for honest labor." The emphasis on honest labor stung, but Ellie simply nodded her thanks. As the wagon pulled away, leaving her alone with her trunks in the middle of the muddy street, she fought down a wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Never in her privileged life had she been so completely on her own, so utterly without resources or protection. The dress shop occupied a narrow building wedged between the general store and a barber shop, its painted sign reading "Sullivan's Fine Sewing" in faded letters. Through the front window, she could see bolts of fabric arranged on shelves, and a woman bent over a sewing machine, her graying hair pinned back in a practical bun. Ellie gathered her courage and pushed open the door, setting off a small bell that announced her arrival. The woman at the sewing machine looked up with sharp blue eyes that took in every detail of Ellie's appearance. The quality wool traveling dress, the leather gloves, the small hat with its modest feather trim. All markers of a social status that seemed incongruous with her obvious need for employment. "Help you?" the woman asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Are you Mrs. Sullivan? I was told you might have need of a seamstress." "Might. Depends on your skills and your circumstances." Mrs. Sullivan rose from her machine and approached, her scrutiny as thorough as any military inspection. "You don't look like someone who's done much sewing for hire. I have considerable experience with needlework, though I confess it's been for personal rather than commercial purposes." Ellie removed her gloves, revealing hands that were soft and uncalloused. Another mark against her in this practical woman's assessment. "I'm also literate and have experience with bookkeeping, if you need assistance with business records." "Literate, are you?" Mrs. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't happen to be that newspaper lady who caused such a stir at Fort Lincoln, would you?" Ellie's heart sank. Even here, in this remote outpost, her reputation had preceded her. "I am Eleanor Whitmore, yes." "Thought so. Heard tell you made quite a spectacle of yourself defending that Indian fellow." Mrs. Sullivan's expression was unreadable. "Takes either considerable courage or considerable foolishness to throw away everything for a principle." "I'm still determining which it was," Ellie replied honestly. To her surprise, Mrs. Sullivan smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had encountered since leaving Fort Lincoln. "Well, I admire a woman who's willing to stand up for what she believes even when it costs her dearly. Lord knows there's precious little of that kind of backbone in the world." "Does that mean you might have work for me?" "Might, but let me be clear about the terms. This isn't charity, and I won't coddle you because you've fallen on hard times. The work is hard, the hours are long, and the pay is barely enough to keep body and soul together. You'll be sewing plain garments for working folks, not fancy dresses for society ladies." "I understand. Do you? Because I've seen plenty of women from your background who think they can manage honest work until their soft hands start bleeding and their backs start aching from bending over a needle all day." Ellie met the older woman's challenging stare directly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I have nowhere else to go and no other options. Whatever the work requires, I'll do it." Mrs. Sullivan studied her for a long moment, then nodded briskly. "All right, then. I can offer you room and board in exchange for your labor, plus a small wage when business permits. The room's just a tiny space upstairs, nothing fancy, but it's clean and warm." "I would be grateful for any accommodation." "Come on, then, let's get you settled, though I should warn you, life here is nothing like what you're accustomed to. We don't put on airs in Willow Creek. People work for what they get, and they don't get much." Mrs. Sullivan led her up a narrow staircase to a small room under the building's eaves. The space was indeed tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small trunk. The single window looked out over the town's muddy main street, providing a view of windswept prairie that stretched to the horizon. "It's not much," Mrs. Sullivan said, following her gaze, "but it's yours if you want it." "It's perfect," Ellie said, and meant it. After the chaos and scrutiny of recent weeks, the simple room felt like a sanctuary. "Good. Now, let's see what you've brought with you that's worth keeping." Ellie opened her trunks under Mrs. Sullivan's watchful eye, revealing the carefully chosen wardrobe that had once seemed so essential to her professional success. The silk day dresses, the elaborate evening gowns, the delicate undergarments trimmed with Brussels lace, all seemed ridiculously impractical in this harsh environment. "These fancy things won't last a week in frontier conditions," Mrs. Sullivan observed, fingering the fabric of a green silk dress. "But the material's good quality. We can remake them into something more suitable." "Whatever you think best." "Smart answer. First lesson of survival out here. Hold on to what's useful and let go of what isn't, no matter how much it cost you in the past." Over the following days, Ellie began to understand the wisdom of that advice. Her soft hands, unaccustomed to constant labor, developed blisters and then calluses as she worked hour after hour at the sewing machine. Her back ached from hunching over intricate stitching, and her eyes burned from straining to see fine work by lamplight. The customers who came to Sullivan's shop were unlike anyone she had encountered in her previous life. Farmers' wives counting every penny, working women who needed sturdy garments that could withstand hard use, children whose mothers stretched every piece of fabric to its limit. They were polite but distant, treating her with the cautious courtesy reserved for strangers whose past remained mysterious. "They'll warm up to you eventually," Mrs. Sullivan explained one evening as they worked by lamplight to finish a rush order. "But folks out here have learned to be careful about trusting newcomers. Too many people come west running from something. Debts, the law, scandal. They need to see that you're here to stay before they'll really accept you." "And am I here to stay?" Ellie asked, surprised by her own uncertainty. "That's for you to decide. But I'll tell you this. Running away from your problems doesn't solve them. They just follow you wherever you go, usually getting bigger along the way." The harsh winter tested every aspect of her endurance. The room upstairs was barely heated, forcing her to pile every available blanket on her narrow bed and still wake shivering on the coldest mornings. Food was simple and often monotonous: beans and salt pork, cornbread and root vegetables stored in the shop's cellar. The luxury items she had taken for granted, fresh fruit, fine teas, delicate pastries, became distant memories. But perhaps the hardest adjustment was the solitude. In her previous life, she had been surrounded by people eager for her company, her opinions, her attention. Here she was simply another working woman struggling to survive, unremarkable except for the occasional whispered speculation about her mysterious past. The loneliness was most acute in the evenings, when the shop was closed and Mrs. Sullivan had retired to her own quarters. Ellie would sit by her small window, looking out at the endless prairie and remembering her conversations with Thomas. She wondered where he was, whether he was safe, whether he ever thought of her. The small carved horse he had given her remained her most precious possession, hidden in the bottom of her trunk where no one else would see it. One particularly difficult evening in early March, as a late blizzard howled outside her window, Ellie found herself questioning every decision that had led her to this point. She could have remained silent during the inquiry, protected her career, returned to Boston to rebuild her reputation. Instead, she had chosen to defend a man who was now beyond her reach, sacrificing everything for a principle that seemed increasingly abstract in the face of daily survival. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Mrs. Sullivan entered carrying a steaming cup of tea and wearing an expression of unusual gentleness. "Thought you might need this," she said, settling into the room's single chair. "This weather's enough to make anyone feel discouraged." "Thank you." Ellie accepted the tea gratefully, savoring the warmth that spread through her chilled fingers. "You've been doing good work these past weeks," Mrs. Sullivan continued. "Better than I expected, to be honest. You've got steady hands and an eye for detail. I appreciate the opportunity you've given me. I know I'm not the ideal employee." "Nobody's ideal, dear. We're all just doing the best we can with what life's handed us." Mrs. Sullivan studied her with those sharp blue eyes. "But I've been wondering, what are you planning to do when spring comes? Stay here and make a permanent life of sewing, or keep running from whatever you're really trying to escape?" The directness of the question caught Ellie off guard. "I'm not sure I know what you mean." "I think you do. You're an educated woman with skills and experience that are wasted in a place like this. You could find work in a larger town, maybe even return to journalism under a different name, but instead you're hiding here like you're afraid of something." Ellie sipped her tea, considering how much to reveal. "I made choices that destroyed my reputation and hurt people I cared about. I'm not sure I deserve a second chance." "Deserve?" Mrs. Sullivan laughed, but not unkindly. "Child, life isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we do with the chances we're given. You stood up for what you believed was right, even when it cost you everything. That takes character. It feels more like foolishness. Maybe. But I'd rather be around foolish people with principles than clever people without them." Mrs. Sullivan rose to leave, then paused at the door. Think about what you really want, Ellie. Not what you've lost, but what you might still gain. This little room and this sewing machine. They're just a resting place, not a destination. Alone again, Ellie considered the older woman's words. For weeks, she had focused on simple survival, getting through each day without dwelling on the future. But Mrs. Sullivan was right. She couldn't hide indefinitely in this remote outpost, pretending that her previous life had never existed. The question was what kind of future might be possible for a woman who had burned all her bridges in defense of a love that could never be. She had discovered reserves of strength and resilience she hadn't known she possessed. But she still had no clear vision of how to use those qualities to build something meaningful. Outside her window, the blizzard continued to rage, covering the prairie in a blanket of white that would eventually melt away to reveal the promise of spring beneath. Perhaps, Ellie thought, that was what she needed to remember, that even the harshest winters eventually ended, and that survival was sometimes just the first step towards something better. But for now, survival was enough. She had learned to value the simple dignity of honest work, the satisfaction of skills earned through hardship, and the unexpected kindness of people who judged her by her actions rather than her reputation. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had built from the ashes of her former existence. And perhaps, when spring finally came, it would be the foundation for something even better. Chapter 9. Servant's Heart. The pounding on the shop door came at 3 o'clock in the morning, urgent and desperate enough to wake Ellie from the fitful sleep that had become her norm since arriving in Willow Creek. She pulled her worn wool wrapper around her shoulders and hurried downstairs, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden planks. "Please, miss, you gotta help us." The voice belonged to a young boy whose face she recognized from the general store. Billy Patterson, son of the blacksmith. His eyes were wide with fear, and his breath came in white puffs in the frigid air. "It's my baby sister, Mary. She's burning up with fever, and Ma don't know what to do." Ellie didn't hesitate. "Wait here while I get dressed and gather some supplies." "But miss, we ain't got much money to pay." "That doesn't matter right now." She was already moving toward the stairs. "Mrs. Sullivan keeps medicinal supplies in the back room. I'll be down in 5 minutes." By the time she had thrown on her warmest dress and gathered what she hoped were the right remedies, Mrs. Sullivan had appeared in her nightgown and shawl, her gray hair in paper curls, but her eyes sharp and alert. "What's the situation?" she asked, beginning to sort through the small collection of herbs and patent medicines they kept for emergencies. "High fever in a young child, the Pattersons." Mrs. Sullivan nodded grimly. "Take the willow bark tea for the fever, and this bottle of honey and whiskey for her throat if she's got the croup. I'll start heating water and tear up some clean rags for compresses." Ellie bundled the supplies into a basket and followed Billy through the empty streets toward the rougher section of town, where the working families lived. The Patterson house was little more than a shack, but warm yellow light spilled from its windows, and she could hear the sound of worried voices before they even reached the door. Inside, she found a scene of barely controlled panic. Mrs. Patterson, a thin woman worn down by hard living and too many pregnancies, knelt beside a makeshift bed where a little girl of perhaps 3 years lay burning with fever. 2 other children huddled in the corner, their faces frightened and confused. "Oh, thank goodness you came," Mrs. Patterson said, looking up with desperate relief. "I didn't know who else to turn to. Doc Henderson's gone to Prairie City to tend a birthing, and Mary's getting worse by the hour." Ellie knelt beside the child and placed her hand on the little girl's forehead. The heat radiating from her skin was alarming, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. She had no formal medical training, but years of caring for servants' children in her father's household had taught her the basics of fever management. "How long has she been like this?" she asked, already beginning to unpack her supplies. "Started yesterday afternoon with just sniffles and tiredness, but by evening she was burning up, and now she ain't keeping anything down." Ellie began, preparing a weak solution of willow bark tea, her hand steady despite her lack of experience with such serious illness. "We need to get her fever down first. Has she been drinking any fluids?" "The mome, but she throws most of it back up." We'll try small sips frequently rather than large amounts, and we need to keep her as cool as possible without chilling her." She looked around the cramped room, noting the single fireplace that served as the only heat source. "Do you have any clean sheets we can use for cooling compresses?" Mrs. Patterson nodded toward a wooden crate that served as storage. "Not much, but what we got is yours to use." For the next several hours, Ellie worked steadily to bring down the child's fever. She applied cool, damp cloths to Mary's forehead and wrists, coaxed tiny sips of medicinal tea past her cracked lips, and monitored her breathing for any signs of improvement or decline. The other children were eventually convinced to try to sleep, but Mrs. Patterson remained at her daughter's bedside, holding her little hand and whispering prayers. As dawn began to break, Mary's fever finally seemed to break as well. Her breathing became easier, and she managed to keep down a full cup of the willow bark tea. When she opened her eyes and asked for water in a whisper voice, her mother burst into tears of relief. "She's going to be all right," Ellie assured the exhausted woman. "But she'll need plenty of rest and fluids for the next few days. Keep giving her the tea every few hours and send Billy to fetch me if the fever returns." "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Patterson said, tears still streaming down her weathered cheeks. "We ain't got much, but—" "You don't owe me anything," Ellie replied firmly. "Just take care of that little girl." She walked back through the quiet streets as the town began to wake up around her, her clothes rumpled and her hair escaping from its pins. Mrs. Sullivan was waiting with hot coffee and a plate of biscuits, but her expression was thoughtful rather than simply relieved. "How's the child?" she asked. "Better. The fever broke just before dawn." Ellie collapsed into a chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "I think she'll recover fully with proper care." "Good. And how do you feel about what you just did?" The question was unexpected. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when was the last time you did something purely because it needed doing, without worrying about what you'd get in return or how it would affect your standing in the community?" Ellie considered the question as she sipped her coffee. "I'm not sure I ever have, actually. Everything I did before, even my charity work in Boston, was partly about maintaining my reputation as a responsible member of society. And last night I just saw a child who needed help." She looked up at Mrs. Sullivan with surprise at her own revelation. "I didn't think about anything else." Mrs. Sullivan smiled with satisfaction. "That's what I thought, and I suspect it won't be the last time." She was right. Word of Ellie's nighttime mercy mission spread quickly through the small community, and within days she found herself being sought out by families facing various crises. There was old Mr. Thompson, whose rheumatism had flared so badly he couldn't split wood for his stove. She spent an afternoon chopping kindling and learned muscles she didn't know she possessed. Then came the McKenna family, whose roof had been damaged in a late winter storm, leaving them with inadequate shelter. Ellie organized the unmarried men in town to help with repairs, using diplomatic skills she had developed in very different circumstances. Each request for help revealed new aspects of frontier life that her privileged background had never prepared her for. She learned to prepare medicinal poultices from common plants, to comfort grieving families who had lost loved ones to accidents or illness, and to stretch meager food supplies to feed unexpected mouths. Most importantly, she learned to listen without judgment to stories of hardship that would have shocked her former social circle. "You're developing quite a reputation," Mrs. Sullivan observed one evening, as they worked side by side, mending a pile of children's clothing that had been brought in by families who couldn't afford new garments. "What kind of reputation?" "The kind that matters, out here. People are saying that Eleanor Whitmore can be counted on when trouble comes calling. That's worth more than all the fancy newspaper articles in the world." Ellie had been so focused on immediate needs that she hadn't really considered how her actions were being perceived by the community. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." "No, you're not. Plenty of people see suffering and look the other way, especially when it's not their problem or their people. You've been helping anyone who asks, regardless of whether they can repay you or whether it benefits you in any way." The truth of that observation struck Ellie as she thought about some of her recent activities. She had spent 2 days nursing Mrs. Kowalski, the Polish immigrant woman whose husband worked at the railroad camp, despite the fact that many townspeople looked down on the foreign workers. She had helped deliver the illegitimate baby of Sally Morrison, the young woman who worked at the saloon, without asking questions or offering judgment. And she had used her own limited funds to buy medicine for the consumptive man who lived alone in a dugout outside town, knowing he would never be able to repay her. "I suppose it feels good to be useful," she said thoughtfully. "In Boston, I was always writing about other people's problems. Here, I can actually do something to help solve them." "There's more to it than that, though," Mrs. Sullivan said, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. "You're discovering who you really are when you're not trying to be someone else." The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door, this one less urgent than Mary Patterson's midnight crisis, but carrying its own sense of importance. Ellie opened it to find a delegation of 3 women she recognized as pillars of the local church community. Mrs. Franklin, the minister's wife, Mrs. Gardner, who ran the general store with her husband, and Mrs. Henley, whose husband owned the largest ranch in the area. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Franklin began formally, "we'd like to speak with you about a matter of some importance to the community." Ellie invited them in, offering chairs around the small table where she and Mrs. Sullivan had been working. The women accepted the seats but seemed uncomfortable, as though they weren't quite sure how to approach their subject. "We've been watching your activities over the past few weeks," Mrs. Gardner said carefully. "Your willingness to help families in need has been noted and appreciated." "I'm glad to be of service," Ellie replied, wondering where this conversation was heading. "The thing is," Mrs. Henley added, "we have a situation that requires someone with particular skills, someone educated and discreet." Mrs. Franklin leaned forward. "There's been an outbreak of typhoid at the railroad camp. The company doctor is overwhelmed and the camp supervisor has requested assistance from town. But most of our women are afraid to go there, and those who aren't afraid lack the education to be truly helpful." "You want me to go to the railroad camp?" Ellie asked. "We know it's a great deal to ask," Mrs. Gardner said quickly. "The conditions there are primitive, and there's real danger of contagion. But you've shown such skill in caring for the sick, and you can read and write, which means you could help keep proper medical records." "I'll go," Ellie said without hesitation. The 3 women exchanged surprised glances. "Just like that?" Mrs. Franklin asked. "People are suffering, and I might be able to help. What else is there to consider?" "Well, there's your safety, for one thing," Mrs. Henley pointed out, "and your reputation. The railroad camp isn't exactly refined society." Ellie almost laughed at the irony. "Mrs. Henley, I think my reputation can survive a few weeks of nursing the sick. If anything, it might benefit from being associated with useful work rather than scandal." After the women left, Mrs. Sullivan shook her head with apparent amazement. "Do you realize what you just agreed to? To help treat typhoid patients at a railroad camp. It sounds challenging but straightforward. Ellie, that camp is rough even by frontier standards. The men there are mostly Irish and Italian immigrants, plus some freed slaves and a few Chinese workers. They live in conditions that would shock you, and many of them have never seen a lady like you except from a distance." "Then perhaps it's time I broadened my horizons," Ellie replied calmly. "Besides, sick people are just sick people, regardless of their background or circumstances." Mrs. Sullivan studied her for a long moment. "You know, when you first arrived here, I thought you were running away from something. Now I'm beginning to think you were running toward something, even if you didn't know what it was." "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything you've done since you got here, all the helping and healing and plain hard work, it's like you were looking for a way to make your life matter in a way it hadn't before." That night, as Ellie prepared for what would likely be several difficult weeks at the railroad camp, she reflected on Mrs. Sullivan's observation. Her former life in Boston had been filled with activity and recognition. But had it really mattered? Her articles had entertained and informed readers, but had they changed anything important? Her social activities had maintained her position in society, but had they helped anyone who truly needed assistance? Here in Willow Creek, she had discovered a different kind of purpose. Each day brought opportunities to make a real difference in people's lives, not through clever words or political influence, but through direct action and genuine compassion. It was harder work than she had ever done, with less recognition and no financial reward, but it felt more meaningful than anything she had accomplished in her previous life. As she packed her few belongings for the trip to the railroad camp, Ellie realized that she was no longer the same woman who had arrived in Willow Creek months earlier, desperate and defeated. She had learned to find value in service rather than status, in compassion rather than cleverness. Most importantly, she had discovered that true strength came not from protecting oneself from hardship, but from willingly taking on other people's burden. The woman who would ride out to the railroad camp tomorrow was someone she was only beginning to recognize. Someone who had been forged in the crucible of loss and hardship, but who had emerged stronger and more purposeful than the privileged journalist who had once thought that writing about problems was the same as solving them. For the first time since leaving Fort Lincoln, Eleanor Whitmore felt as though she was exactly where she belonged. Chapter 10. The Bridge Builder. The messenger from the railroad camp arrived on a lathered horse as the first blizzard of March howled across the prairie, bringing news that sent a chill through Ellie's heart that had nothing to do with the weather. She met him at the door of Mrs. Sullivan's shop, where she had been preparing supplies for another trip to tend the remaining typhoid cases. "Miss Whitmore," the young man gasped, ice crystals forming in his beard. "You need to come quick. The storm's trapped 3 work crews between here and Prairie City, and there's been an accident at the bridge construction. Men are hurt bad, and the camp's running out of food and medicine." "How many men are we talking about?" she asked, already reaching for her heaviest coat. "Near 40 souls, maybe more. They got caught when the weather turned sudden-like, and now they're stuck in shelter that won't hold against this wind much longer." Ellie looked out at the driving snow that had already begun to drift against the buildings. This was the kind of prairie blizzard that could last for days, trapping travelers and overwhelming unprepared communities. If 40 men were stranded without adequate food and shelter, with injuries among them, the situation could become catastrophic quickly. "Mrs. Sullivan," she called, moving toward the back room where they stored emergency supplies. "We need to organize a relief effort immediately." The older woman appeared, took one look at the messenger's expression, and began pulling on her coat. "What do you need?" "Food, blankets, medical supplies, everything we can gather. And we need to convince the townspeople to contribute despite the storm. That's not going to be easy," Mrs. Sullivan warned. "Folks are going to be worried about their own families first, especially with weather like this." Ellie paused in her gathering of supplies, struck by a sudden realization. The stranded work crews were made up largely of immigrants and freed slaves, men who were often viewed with suspicion or indifference by the established townspeople. Convincing the community to risk their own safety and resources for these workers would require more than simple appeals to charity. "Then we'll have to give them a reason to care," she said grimly. Within an hour, despite the worsening storm, she had managed to gather a core group of volunteers in the church basement. Mrs. Franklin, the minister's wife, had opened the building and helped spread word through the community. The group was smaller than Ellie had hoped, perhaps 15 people huddled around the church's inadequate stove. But it included some of the town's most influential residents. "The situation is this," Ellie began, standing before the assembled group with her notebook in hand. 40 men are trapped in inadequate shelter with limited food, medical supplies, and fuel. Some are injured and need immediate attention. If we don't act quickly, we could be facing multiple deaths from exposure, starvation, or untreated injuries." "Miss Whitmore," interrupted Henry Gardner, who owned the general store, "I sympathize with their plight, but we can't risk our own people in this weather. And frankly, we don't have surplus supplies to spare with winter still upon us." Several other voices murmured agreement. Ellie had expected this response, but it still frustrated her. She thought of the men she had come to know during her weeks at the railroad camp, hardworking immigrants who sent most of their wages back to families in Ireland and Italy, freed slaves who were building new lives through back-breaking labor, Chinese workers who faced discrimination but persevered with quiet dignity. "Mr. Gardner, I understand your concerns, she replied carefully, but consider this. Those men represent a significant economic investment in our region's development. The railroad they're building will bring prosperity to every business in this town. Allowing them to die for lack of assistance would be both morally wrong and economically foolish. That's assuming we could even reach them safely, added Dr. Morrison, who had recently returned from Prairie City. The wind out there would knock a man off his horse, and the snow's drifting so deep that wagons can't get through. Ellie had been thinking about the logistics problem even as she organized the meeting. We don't need to reach them directly. There's a Lakota winter camp about 5 miles southeast of the stranded crews. If we could get word to them, they might be willing to help. The suggestion caused an immediate stir of uncomfortable murmurs. Mrs. Henley spoke up with obvious disapproval. Miss Whitmore, surely you're not suggesting we ask Indians for assistance after all the recent troubles? I'm suggesting we ask fellow human beings who have extensive experience surviving prairie winters for help, saving lives, Ellie replied firmly. The Lakota know how to travel safely in conditions that would kill the rest of us. They have techniques for providing emergency shelter and finding food sources we wouldn't even recognize. But how could we even contact them? Dr. Morrison asked. And why would they help white men who've done nothing but displace them from their traditional lands? Ellie took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would reveal more about her past than she had shared with anyone in Willow Creek. Because I know someone who could serve as an intermediary, someone they trust who speaks their language and understands their customs. Who? Demanded Gardner. Thomas Crowfeather. He's camped with Chief Standing Bear's band about 20 miles north of here. If we could get a message to him explaining the situation, I believe he would help coordinate a rescue effort. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and concerns. Mrs. Sullivan finally spoke up. Ellie, are you certain about this? It would mean revealing your connection to someone who was involved in all that trouble at Fort Lincoln. I'm certain, Ellie replied. Thomas Crowfeather is a man of honor who wouldn't let people die from neglect, regardless of their race or the politics involved. What followed was the most difficult negotiation of her life. She had to convince skeptical townspeople to trust not only an Indian they had never met, but also her own judgment, despite her notorious past. Some residents left the meeting rather than participate in what they saw as a dangerous folly. Others stayed, but voiced serious reservations about involving themselves with Indians at all. But gradually, as Ellie explained her plan in detail and answered every objection with practical solutions, a consensus began to emerge. The economic arguments proved persuasive with the business owners, while the humanitarian appeals moved the church members. Most importantly, her obvious knowledge of both cultures and her practical experience with crisis management convinced even the skeptics that she might actually know what she was talking about. All right, Mayor Davidson finally said. We'll try your plan, but how do we contact this Crowfeather fellow? I'm certainly not riding out in this storm to find an Indian camp. I'll write a message, Ellie said, and I'll ask Jake Morrison to carry it. He knows the country well enough to reach Standing Bear's camp even in this weather. Jake Morrison, a grizzled former trapper who worked occasionally for the freight companies, nodded slowly. Could make it there and back assuming they don't shoot me on sight for approaching their camp during a blizzard. They won't, Ellie assured him. Show them this. She pulled the small carved horse from her pocket, the precious gift Thomas had given her during their farewell at Fort Lincoln. Thomas will recognize it and know the message comes from someone he trusts. While the volunteers organized the collection of supplies, Ellie worked on composing her message to Thomas. It had to convey the urgency of the situation while also explaining her own circumstances and requesting help that went far beyond what might normally be expected. Thomas, she wrote, I pray this finds you and your uncle well. I am writing from Willow Creek, where I have been living since leaving Fort Lincoln. Crisis has developed that requires your unique skills and the wisdom of your people. 40 railroad workers are trapped by the blizzard with inadequate shelter, limited food, and several serious injuries. The town has agreed to provide supplies, but we need guides who can travel safely in these conditions and knowledge of winter survival techniques. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but these men will die without help, and you are the only person I know who might be able to coordinate a rescue effort. The bearer of this message is Jake Morrison, a trustworthy man who can provide more details about the location and situation. Whatever our personal history, I believe you will not let innocent people suffer when you have the power to help them. Eleanor Jake Morrison read the message, nodded approvingly, and tucked it into his coat along with the carved horse. I'll have an answer by tomorrow evening, assuming the storm breaks enough for travel. While they waited for Jake's return, Ellie threw herself into organizing the relief effort with an energy that surprised even her. She coordinated the collection of blankets, food, and medical supplies from every household willing to contribute. She worked with Dr. Morrison to prepare emergency medical kits suitable for field treatment of various injuries. Most importantly, she began drafting another kind of message, one that would reach far beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek. That evening, by lamplight in her small room above the shop, she began writing the kind of articles she had never attempted before. Instead of the careful, objective journalism that had built her reputation, she poured her heart onto the page, describing the crisis in terms that would make Eastern readers understand the human cost of frontier development. The men trapped by this blizzard are not statistics in a railroad company's ledger, she wrote. They are fathers who left families in Ireland hoping to earn enough money to bring their children to America. They are freed slaves who see railroad work as a path to the economic independence that slavery denied them. They are Chinese immigrants who face prejudice and violence, yet continue to contribute their skills to building the infrastructure that will unite our nation. When we read about frontier development in our comfortable Eastern parlors, we rarely consider the individual human stories behind the grand statistics of miles of track laid and tons of freight transported. But tonight, 40 men are huddled in improvised shelters while a prairie blizzard tries to claim their lives. Their survival depends not on government policy or corporate planning, but on the willingness of ordinary people to extend help across the boundaries that too often divide us. She wrote through the night, crafting what she knew would be the most important piece of her career. This was not journalism designed to advance her reputation or please her editor, but writing born from direct experience and genuine compassion. Every word carried the weight of faces she had seen, hands she had held, stories she had heard during her months of tending the sick and helping the struggling. When Jake Morrison returned the next evening, snow-covered but grinning, he brought news that filled Ellie with relief and something deeper, a renewed faith in the fundamental decency that could bridge even the widest cultural divides. Your Indian friend says he'll do it, Jake reported to the assembled volunteers. In fact, he's already organizing a joint effort between his people and Two Dogs Band to provide guides and winter survival expertise. They'll meet our supply wagons at Miller's Creek as soon as the storm breaks. Did he say anything else? Ellie asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Jake studied her with knowing eyes. Eld said to tell you that some debts of honor transcend personal considerations, and that he's grateful for the opportunity to prove that his people's commitment to preserving life extends to all human beings. The rescue operation that followed proved to be a masterwork of cross-cultural cooperation. Lakota guides led supply wagons through snowdrifts that would have been impassable to anyone unfamiliar with winter travel techniques. Native knowledge of emergency shelter construction kept the stranded workers alive until they could be evacuated to safety. Most remarkably, the joint effort demonstrated to everyone involved that racial and cultural differences need not prevent people from working together when faced with common challenges. Of the 40 men originally trapped, 38 survived. The 2 who died had succumbed to injuries sustained in the original accident before help could reach them. It was a tragic loss, but far less devastating than the wholesale catastrophe that had threatened. As Ellie helped tend the rescued workers in the church basement that served as a temporary hospital, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition. Her article about the crisis, which she had sent anonymously to 3 major Eastern newspapers, would appear within the week under the byline of Frontier Observer. The funds it raised would help support the families of the men who had died and provide assistance to those still recovering from their ordeal. "You did something remarkable here," Dr. Morrison told her as they worked side by side treating frostbite and exhaustion. "Not just the rescue itself, but the way you brought everyone together. I've never seen anything like it." "It wasn't just me," Ellie replied, checking the temperature of a Chinese worker who was slowly recovering from severe exposure. "It was what happens when people stop seeing each other as strangers or enemies and start recognizing our common humanity. Still, it took someone with your particular background to make it possible. Your knowledge of both cultures, your writing skills, your ability to negotiate between different groups. Not many people could have pulled this off." As she settled the rescued man more comfortably on his makeshift bed, Ellie reflected on the truth of that observation. All of her experiences, the privileged education that had taught her to write persuasively, the months at Fort Lincoln that had given her insight into Native American perspectives, the humbling time in Willow Creek that had shown her the value of direct service, had somehow combined to make this moment possible. For the first time since her disgrace at Fort Lincoln, she began to see her life not as a series of disconnected failures and recoveries, but as a journey toward this specific purpose. Every loss had taught her something essential. Every hardship had strengthened her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Outside the church windows, the blizzard was finally beginning to subside, revealing a landscape transformed by snow but fundamentally unchanged. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new chances to build bridges between people who saw each other as different or threatening. But tonight, Eleanor Whitmore knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do with the rest of her life. Chapter 11. Love's Return. The spring morning brought word that would change everything, delivered by a courier whose urgent manner suggested news of great importance. Ellie was tending her small garden behind Mrs. Sullivan's shop, coaxing vegetables from the prairie soil that had seemed so foreign to her just months before, when the young soldier approached with official dispatch pouch in hand. "Ms. Whitmore, I have a message from Colonel Hayes at Fort Abraham Lincoln. He requests your immediate attention to a matter of territorial significance." Ellie wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the sealed envelope with growing apprehension. Her name had been cleared of wrongdoing months ago, but she had assumed her connection to Fort Lincoln was permanently severed. The formal language of the courier's delivery suggested this was not a personal communication. The letter bore the colonel's official seal and was dated just 3 days prior. "Miss Whitmore, recent events have created a situation requiring expertise in cross-cultural communication and negotiation. A dispute has arisen between local ranchers and several Lakota bands over grazing rights in the Black Hills region. Previous attempts at resolution have failed, and tensions are escalating toward potential violence. Your recent success in coordinating relief efforts that involved both white and Native communities has come to the attention of territorial officials. We have been asked by the Department of the Interior to request your assistance in mediating discussions that might prevent armed conflict. Thomas Crowfeather has been appointed as official liaison for the tribal representatives. He has specifically requested that you be invited to participate in these negotiations, citing your proven ability to understand and respect both perspectives involved. If you are willing to undertake this responsibility, please accompany the bearer of this message to Fort Lincoln immediately. Time is of the essence. Most respectfully, Colonel William Hayes Ellie." Read the letter twice before its full implications settled in her mind. Thomas had requested her specifically. After more than a year of separation, after the devastating end to their relationship, he wanted her involvement in negotiations that could determine the peace of the entire region. "Ms. Whitmore," the courier prompted gently. Colonel Hayes emphasized the urgency of the situation. "Several incidents have already occurred, and both sides are preparing for what they see as inevitable conflict." "Yes, of course." She folded the letter carefully. "I'll need an hour to prepare for the journey." Mrs. Sullivan appeared at her elbow as though she had been waiting for this moment. "So it's finally come, has it? I wondered when something would call you back to your real work." "This isn't my real work," Ellie protested, looking around at the garden she had planted, the shop where she had learned to find purpose in simple service. Child, this has been preparation for your real work. Everything you've learned here about serving others, about understanding different kinds of people, about finding strength you didn't know you had. It's all been leading to this moment. An hour later, Ellie found herself riding toward Fort Lincoln with a mixture of anticipation and dread that made her stomach clench with every mile. She had grown and changed in ways that went far deeper than the calluses on her hands or the practical skills she had acquired. The woman who had left Fort Lincoln in disgrace bore little resemblance to the person she had become. But would Thomas see those changes, or would he remember only the privileged journalist who had brought such trouble into both their lives? Fort Lincoln looked exactly the same as she remembered, but her perspective on it had shifted dramatically. Where she had once seen the center of frontier civilization, she now saw an isolated military outpost struggling to maintain order in a vast land it barely understood. The soldiers who greeted her arrival were polite but reserved, clearly uncertain how to treat someone whose reputation had undergone such dramatic reversals. Colonel Hayes received her in his office with the same courtesy he had shown during her first visit, but there was a wariness in his manner that spoke of hard lessons learned. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming so quickly. I must confess, when your name was suggested for this assignment, I had serious reservations. But your recent work has demonstrated qualities that may be essential to preventing a very ugly situation from deteriorating further." "What exactly has happened, Colonel?" "Cattle ranchers have been expanding their operations into areas that several Lakota bands consider traditional hunting grounds. Both sides have legitimate claims under different interpretations of various treaty provisions, but instead of seeking legal resolution, we've had fence cutting, cattle rustling, and 2 incidents of violence that left men wounded on both sides. And attempts at negotiation have failed spectacularly. The ranchers refuse to recognize any Indian claims to the disputed territory, while the tribal representatives insist that the government has no authority to grant grazing rights to land that was never properly ceded. Previous mediators have been completely unable to bridge the gap between these positions." "Where is Mr. Crowfeather in all this?" Colonel Hayes's expression softened slightly. "He's been serving as a peace advocate among the various tribal factions, trying to prevent the young warriors from taking matters into their own hands. But his influence is limited, and there are those on both sides who see his willingness to negotiate as weakness rather than wisdom." Before Ellie could respond, a commotion outside the window drew their attention. Through the glass, she could see a delegation of riders approaching the main gate. Indians in traditional dress, accompanied by a few military escorts. Even from a distance, she recognized the tall figure leading the group, sitting his horse with the same unconscious grace she remembered so vividly. "That would be the tribal delegation arriving for tomorrow's formal discussions," Colonel Hayes said. "Perhaps you'd like to observe their arrival before we continue our briefing." Ellie nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She followed the colonel onto the porch of his headquarters and watched as the riders crossed the parade ground toward the guest quarters. Thomas rode at the front beside an elderly chief she didn't recognize, his bearing dignified and confident in a way that spoke of increased authority and respect. He had changed. The young man she remembered had carried himself with quiet dignity, but this Thomas radiated the kind of natural leadership that drew attention without demanding it. His clothing reflected his elevated status, traditional elements combined with items that spoke of his role as a bridge between worlds, but worn with an assurance that needed no explanation or apology. As the delegation dismounted near the guest quarters, Tomas looked across the parade ground, and his eyes found hers with unerring accuracy. For a moment that seemed to stretch across the months of separation, they simply looked at each other. His expression was unreadable from that distance, but something in his posture suggested both recognition and wariness. "I believe Mr. Crowfeather would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you privately before tomorrow's formal sessions," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "Shall I arrange a meeting?" "Yes," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That would be appropriate." The meeting was arranged for that evening in the same conference room where they had first met more than a year ago. Ellie arrived early, using the time to compose herself and consider what she wanted to say to the man who had once meant everything to her. When Thomas entered, accompanied by the elderly chief she had seen earlier, she rose to greet them with as much professional dignity as she could manage. "Miss Whitmore," Thomas said formally, his voice carrying the same careful courtesy she remembered. "May I present Chief Joseph Spotted Eagle, who leads the delegation representing the affected tribal bands. Uncle, this is Eleanor Whitmore, the woman I told you about." The old chief studied her with sharp eyes that seemed to see far more than her surface appearance. When he spoke, it was in Lakota, but his tone conveyed both curiosity and reserved approval. "My uncle says he has heard of your work during the winter crisis," Thomas translated. "He is interested to meet the white woman who convinced her people to cooperate with ours for the sake of saving lives." "I am honored by his recognition," Ellie replied, "but the cooperation came from people of goodwill on both sides. I simply helped facilitate communication." Thomas translated her response, and Chief Spotted Eagle nodded, with what might have been satisfaction. He spoke again, at greater length this time, and Thomas listened carefully before turning back to Ellie. "She says that someone who can build bridges during times of crisis might also be able to build them during times of potential conflict. He hopes that your presence here indicates that some white people are truly committed to finding peaceful solutions." "I hope so as well," Ellie said sincerely. "Chief Spotted Eagle, I want you to know that I understand the frustration your people must feel when agreements are made and then ignored or reinterpreted to serve others' purposes, but I also believe that there are ways to resolve these disputes that don't require violence." After Chief Spotted Eagle departed for his quarters, Thomas remained behind, moving to the window where he stood with his back to her for several long moments. When he finally turned around, his carefully maintained formality had given way to something more personal. "Ellie," he said quietly, and the sound of her name on his lips sent the same warm shock through her that it always had. "I wondered if I would ever see you again." "I wondered the same thing." She remained by the conference table, maintaining the distance between them that seemed safer than trying to bridge it. "You look well, Thomas. Different, but well. Different how? More confident? More settled in your authority. The people around you clearly respect your leadership. The people around you clearly respect your leadership." Thomas moved closer, though he still kept several feet between them. "And you look different as well. Stronger somehow. Less..." Ellie laughed softly. "That's one way to put it. I've learned that polish doesn't hold up well under real-world conditions. Jake Morrison told me about what you've been doing in Willow Creek. The medical work, the relief efforts, the way you've helped bring different communities together. It sounds like you've found your true calling." "I've found work that feels meaningful in ways my journalism never did. Whether it's my calling..." She shrugged. "I suppose that remains to be seen." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each studying the changes that time and experience had wrought in the other. Finally, Thomas spoke the question that hung between them. "Why did you agree to come here, Ellie? These negotiations will be difficult and potentially dangerous. You could have refused and continued your new life in safety." "For the same reason you requested my involvement, I imagine, because sometimes personal feelings have to be set aside for the sake of preventing unnecessary suffering." "Is that the only reason?" Ellie met his eyes directly. "No. I came because I wanted to see if the man I once cared about had found the peace and purpose he was searching for, and because I hoped that together we might be able to accomplish something neither of us could achieve alone." "And what do you see when you look at me now?" "I see someone who has grown into the leader he was always meant to be. Someone who has found ways to serve his people while maintaining his integrity. Someone who..." She paused, then decided to risk complete honesty. "Someone I admire even more than I did before." Thomas moved closer, close enough that she could see the warmth in his dark eyes that his formal manner had concealed. "And I see a woman who has discovered her true strength by learning to serve others without counting the cost. Someone who has proven that real character is revealed not by success, but by how one responds to adversity." Thomas, about what happened before was necessary, he interrupted gently. We were both different people then, caught in circumstances that made it impossible for us to see clearly. What matters now is who we've become and what we can accomplish together. The next morning brought the formal negotiations. Conducted in the same conference room, but with a very different atmosphere from the treaty discussions Ellie had once observed. This time, she sat at the table as an equal participant, her role as mediator officially recognized by both sides. The issues were complex and emotionally charged. Ranchers who had invested their life savings in cattle operations argued that they had paid for grazing rights in good faith and couldn't simply abandon their investments. Tribal representatives countered that the land in question had never been legally ceded and that their people's survival depended on preserving traditional hunting grounds. The fundamental problem, Thomas explained during a break in the discussions, is that both sides are operating from completely different understandings of what constitutes legitimate ownership. The ranchers see land as property that can be bought and sold. My people see it as a living entity that belongs to itself and can only be temporarily used by those who treat it with respect. Ellie had been thinking about exactly that issue. What if we could find a way to honor both perspectives? Some form of shared use that protects the rancher's investments while preserving the tribal rights. How would that work practically? Seasonal agreements. Cattle grazing during certain months when it doesn't interfere with traditional hunting or spiritual practices. Compensation to the tribal bands for the use of their traditional territory. Joint management of the land to prevent overgrazing or other damage. Thomas looked at her with growing interest. And that would require both sides to give up their absolute positions. Yes, but it might also give both sides what they actually need, as opposed to what they think they want. The proposal Ellie outlined during the afternoon session was met with skepticism from both sides, but also with grudging interest from the more pragmatic participants. The Ranchers Association representative admitted that seasonal use would actually be more economical than year-round grazing, while Chief Spotted Eagle acknowledged that compensation payments could provide resources his people desperately needed. What followed was 3 days of intense negotiation, with Ellie and Thomas working together to translate not just languages, but entire worldviews. They found themselves falling back into the easy intellectual partnership that had characterized their earlier relationship, building on each other's insights and covering each other's weaknesses with practiced efficiency. You two work well together, Colonel Hayes observed during a private moment. It's clear that you understand each other's thinking. We've had practice, Ellie replied diplomatically. But as the negotiations progressed, she became increasingly aware that their partnership went deeper than mere professional compatibility. Thomas seemed to anticipate her thoughts, offering supporting arguments just when she needed them most. She found herself instinctively providing the cultural translations that allowed him to present tribal concerns in terms the white participants could understand. On the final evening, as they worked together to draft the formal agreement that both sides had tentatively accepted, Thomas finally addressed the personal undercurrent that had run through all their interactions. Ellie, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Of course. Do you think it's possible for two people to rebuild something that was broken, or are some things lost forever? She set down her pen and looked at him directly. I think that depends on whether the people involved are the same ones who broke it in the first place. What do you mean? I mean that the woman who left Fort Lincoln in disgrace, and the man who felt responsible for her downfall, those people don't exist anymore. We've both become different people through our experiences. So perhaps the question isn't whether we can rebuild what we had, but whether who we are now can build something new. Thomas reached across the table and gently touched her hand. And do you think we can? I think, Ellie said carefully, that two people who can negotiate peace between communities that have been enemies for generations might be able to find a way to be honest with each other about their feelings. Then let me be honest with you. Eleanor Whitmore, I have spent every day of the past year thinking about you, wondering if you were safe, if you were happy, if you regretted the choices that brought us together and tore us apart. When I learned about your work in Willow Creek, I felt proud of you in ways I had no right to feel. And when this opportunity arose to work with you again, I knew I had to take it, even though I wasn't sure my heart could bear seeing you and then losing you again. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet intensity of his words. And I have spent every day wondering if you found the peace you were searching for, if you were able to use your gifts in service of your people without sacrificing your own happiness. I told myself that I came here only to help prevent a war, but the truth is that I would have come just for the chance to see you again. Then perhaps, Thomas said, lifting her hand to his lips, we should stop pretending that we can work together as strangers and admit that some connections survive even the worst circumstances. And perhaps, Ellie replied, we should focus on building something new instead of mourning what we lost. The peace accord they negotiated would prove to be a model for similar agreements across the frontier, practical compromises that honored the legitimate needs of both sides while preventing the kind of violence that had seemed inevitable. But for Ellie and Thomas, the real victory was not the preservation of peace between communities, but the discovery that love, like the land itself, could survive the harshest seasons and bloom again when conditions were right. Chapter 12. Higher Than Before. The wedding preparations began at dawn on the first Saturday in June, with representatives from both communities working side by side to create something that had never been attempted before. A ceremony that would honor both Lakota and European traditions while offending neither. Ellie stood in the small room behind the church, watching through the window as men erected a ceremonial arbor beside the building, while women arranged wildflowers and traditional symbols in patterns that spoke of unity rather than division. I never thought I'd see such a thing in my lifetime, Mrs. Sullivan said, adjusting the pearl buttons on Ellie's dress with hands that trembled slightly from emotion rather than age. Two peoples coming together like this, celebrating instead of fighting. The dress itself was a masterwork of compromise, fashioned from ivory silk in a style appropriate for a proper white wedding, but embroidered with beadwork patterns that Thomas's grandmother had designed specifically for the occasion. The result was elegant, yet meaningful, traditional, yet unique, much like the relationship it was meant to celebrate. "Are you nervous?" asked Mary Patterson, now a healthy 7-year-old who had insisted on helping with the wedding preparations. She had become something of a shadow to Ellie over the past months, declaring her intention to become a lady doctor when she grew up. "Terribly nervous," Ellie admitted with a smile, but in the best possible way. Through the window, she could see Thomas speaking with Colonel Hayes and several other officials who had traveled from as far as Washington to witness what they were calling a historic moment in frontier relations. Tomas wore traditional Lakota wedding attire that had been in his family for generations, an intricately beaded shirt and ceremonial accessories that spoke of his heritage, combined with dark trousers and boots that acknowledged his role in the white world. The past 6 months had brought changes that neither of them could have imagined when they first began working together on the peace negotiations. The success of their mediation efforts had led to Thomas being appointed as the first official Native American liaison to the Department of the Interior, a position that would allow him to advocate for his people from within the government structure. Meanwhile, Ellie had used her savings and a small loan from Mrs. Sullivan to establish the Frontier Voice, a weekly newspaper dedicated to promoting understanding between different communities across the territorial region. "Ms. Whitmore," called Dr. Morrison from the doorway, "the ceremony is ready to begin whenever you are." Ellie took one last look in the small mirror, checking that the eagle-feathered Thomas had given her, a gift from Chief Spotted Eagle to honor her role in the peace negotiations, was properly secured in her hair, alongside the pearl combs that had belonged to her grandmother. Then she picked up the bouquet of prairie wildflowers mixed with white roses and followed her makeshift wedding party toward the door. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Willow Creek had ever witnessed. Reverend Franklin conducted the Christian portions of the service with dignity and respect, while Chief Spotted Eagle led the traditional Lakota elements with equal reverence. The two religious traditions flowed together seamlessly, creating something new while honoring both ancient customs. When Thomas spoke his vows, first in Lakota and then in English, his words carried the weight of promises that went beyond personal commitment to encompass their shared mission of building bridges between divided peoples. "Eleanor," he said, his dark eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity, "you have taught me that love is not diminished by being shared across cultural boundaries, but made stronger by it. I promise to stand beside you as we work to create understanding where there has been mistrust, cooperation where there has been conflict, and hope where there has been despair." When Ellie's turn came, she found herself speaking from the heart rather than from the carefully prepared words she had memorized. "Thomas, you showed me that true strength comes not from protecting oneself from difficulty, but from willingly taking on challenges that serve something greater than personal ambition. I promise to be your partner in building the kind of world where children of all backgrounds can grow up seeing each other as friends rather than enemies." As they exchanged rings, his a traditional silver band, hers adorned with a small turquoise stone that matched the beadwork on her dress, Ellie felt the presence of everyone who had helped shape their journey. Mrs. Sullivan dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Colonel Hayes stood at attention with obvious pride. Even more moving was the sight of former patients from the railroad camp standing beside Lakota warriors who had participated in the winter rescue efforts, all united in celebration of this moment. The reception that followed took place in the open area between the church and the town's main street, with tables laden with foods that represented both traditions. Irish stew sat alongside venison prepared in the traditional Lakota manner, while cornbread shared space with fry bread made according to recipes passed down through generations. "I have to ask," said Senator Morrison, the territorial representative who had replaced the disgraced Senator Crawford, as he approached the newlyweds during the festivities. "What are your plans now? The success of your newspaper has attracted attention in Washington, and there's talk of expanding your model to other frontier regions." Ellie exchanged glances with Thomas before answering. "We've discussed that possibility, Senator, but our immediate focus is on deepening the work we've already begun here. Real change takes time, and we believe this region can serve as a proving ground for the kind of cooperation that might be possible elsewhere. Besides," Thomas added with a smile, "we have some personal priorities to consider as well." The senator raised his eyebrows questioningly, but before either could elaborate, they were interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, carrying a leather pouch that clearly contained official documents. "Telegram just came through from Washington," he announced, handing the pouch to Thomas. "Looks important." Thomas opened the message and read it quickly, his expression shifting from curiosity to amazement. "Ellie, you need to see this." The telegram was from the Secretary of the Interior, formally requesting that both Thomas and Ellie travel to Washington to consult on a new policy initiative aimed at preventing frontier conflicts through improved communication and cultural understanding. "They want us to help design a program based on our work here," Thomas explained to the gathering crowd. "Training for government officials in cross-cultural negotiation, guidelines for journalists covering frontier issues, formal protocols for dispute resolution." "It's an honor," Ellie said carefully, "but also a tremendous responsibility." "One you're both uniquely qualified to handle," Colonel Hayes interjected. "The success you've achieved here speaks for itself. The peace accord has held for 6 months without a single violation, and your newspaper has been reprinted by publications from New York to San Francisco." As the celebration continued into the evening, Ellie found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been an ambitious journalist seeking recognition and career advancement. 2 years ago, she had been a disgraced woman struggling to survive in a frontier town. Today, she was the editor of an influential newspaper, a respected mediator between cultures, and the wife of a man who shared her vision of a more just and understanding world. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, joining her at the edge of the celebration, where she had retreated for a moment of quiet reflection. "About how impossible this would have seemed when I first arrived at Fort Lincoln," she replied, gesturing toward the mixed group of celebrants. White families and Lakota families eating together, children playing games that combine traditions from both cultures, men who once saw each other as enemies now discussing business partnerships, and wondering if we're dreaming too big when we think this could be replicated elsewhere. Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing over the unfamiliar weight of her wedding ring. Do you remember what my grandmother used to say about dreams? No, tell me. She said that the biggest dreams are the only ones worth pursuing because small dreams don't have the power to change the world. As they walked back toward the celebration, Ellie saw their work with new clarity. The newspaper that had started as a local publication was already influencing policy discussions in territorial capitals. The mediation techniques they had developed were being studied by officials across the frontier. Most importantly, they had proven that people from vastly different backgrounds could not only coexist, but actively support each other when given the right leadership and opportunity. Thomas, she said as they reached the edge of the gathering, I think we should accept the Washington assignment. Are you certain? It would mean leaving this community just when our work here is really taking root. I think the roots are strong enough now to survive our temporary absence. And if we can help prevent even one unnecessary conflict by sharing what we've learned, she shrugged. How can we not try? The evening concluded with a traditional Lakota blessing ceremony, during which Chief Spotted Eagle spoke words in his native language that Thomas translated for the gathered crowd. Him says that today we have witnessed the creation of something new, not the victory of one tradition over another, but the birth of a third way that honors the best of both. He believes that our children will grow up in a world where such unions are celebrated rather than feared, and where the strength that comes from diversity is recognized as a gift rather than seen as a threat. As they prepared to leave for their wedding night, which would be spent in a small cabin that the community had prepared as their first home together, Ellie was approached by a delegation of the town's children, including Mary Patterson and several young Lakota who had become regular visitors to Willow Creek. Mrs. Crowfeather, Mary said with great formality, we made you something. She presented Ellie with a book they had created together, stories written in both English and Lakota that celebrated friendship and cooperation between children of different backgrounds. The illustrations, drawn by young artists from both communities, showed scenes of the kind of integrated world that the adults were working to create. This is the most beautiful wedding gift we could have received, Ellie said, kneeling to embrace the children. And I promise you that Mr. Crowfeather and I will work very hard to make sure the world you're imagining becomes real. Epilogue. 5 years later, the small schoolhouse that Ellie and Thomas had built behind their expanded home buzzed with the voices of children speaking in 3 languages, English, Lakota, and the mixture of both that had evolved naturally among the young people of their community. Ellie stood at the window of her study, watching her husband lead a group of 8-year-olds in a traditional storytelling circle while their 4-year-old daughter, Sarah, listened with rapt attention from her place in his lap. Mama, called their 6-year-old son, David, bursting through the door with the energy that characterized everything he did. Papa's telling the story about the time you and he stopped a war with just words. Is he now? Ellie smiled, setting aside the manuscript she had been editing. The Frontier Voice had grown from a local weekly to a nationally distributed monthly publication that was required reading for anyone interested in territorial affairs. More importantly, it had inspired similar publications across the frontier, creating a network of voices committed to promoting understanding rather than perpetuating conflict. Will you tell us the real story later? David asked. The one with all the parts Papa leaves out about how scared you both were? Of course, Ellie promised, ruffling his dark hair that was already showing the stubborn cowlick he had inherited from his father. But first, don't you have lessons to finish? David groaned dramatically but returned to his desk where he was working on a writing assignment that required him to interview elderly members of both communities about their memories of life before the peace accords. It was exactly the kind of project that would have been impossible just a few years earlier, but which now seemed natural to children who had grown up seeing cooperation as normal rather than remarkable. Through the window, Ellie could see the afternoon mail coach approaching. bringing the latest batch of correspondence that would require her attention. Letters from government officials seeking advice on handling territorial disputes, requests from journalists wanting to visit their community to study their methods, and invitations to speak at conferences across the country. The success of their work had created opportunities they had never imagined, but also responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming. "Another Washington invitation," Thomas announced later that evening as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and rose. He handed her the official envelope that bore the seal of the president's office. "What this time?" Ellie asked, though she suspected she already knew. "A request to head a new commission on frontier policy. Permanent positions for both of us, substantial salaries, the opportunity to influence national policy on territorial development." Ellie leaned back in her chair, considering the weight of such an offer. 5 years of building their community, establishing their newspaper, and raising their children in a place where cultural integration was not just possible, but thriving. Could they leave all of that for the uncertain promise of national influence? "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that the most important work we do happens right here, teaching our children that differences in background don't have to mean differences in worth. Showing our neighbors that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict. Creating a model that others can study and adapt to their own circumstances. But if we could prevent other conflicts by sharing what we've learned on a national scale, we already are doing that through the newspaper, the speaking engagements, the visitors who come here to see what we've built. Sometimes the most effective way to change the world is to create something so compelling that others want to replicate it." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah appeared in the doorway, wearing her nightgown and carrying the rag doll that had been made for her by Thomas's grandmother before the old woman passed away 2 years earlier. "Papa, will you tell me the horse story before bed?" she asked, climbing into his lap with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. "Which horse story?" Thomas asked, though they both knew the answer. "The one about the little carved horse that helped Mama and Papa find each other again." As Thomas began the familiar tale, simplified for young ears but containing all the essential elements of love, loss, and redemption, Ellie felt a deep contentment settle over her. The carved horse still sat on her desk, a daily reminder of the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You know," she said quietly to Tammuz after Sarah had been tucked into bed and David had finished his evening reading, "I think we should decline the Washington position." "Are you certain?" "It represents everything you once thought you wanted. National recognition, political influence, the chance to shape policy at the highest levels. I'm certain, because I've learned the difference between what I thought I wanted and what actually matters." She gestured toward the schoolhouse, where tomorrow would bring another day of children learning to see past differences toward common humanity. "This is where we belong, Thomas, not because it's safe or comfortable, but because it's where we can do the most good. Even though it means smaller ambitions, less recognition, fewer opportunities for advancement." Ellie laughed softly. "Smaller ambitions? We're raising a generation of children who see cooperation as natural and conflict as avoidable. We've created a community that serves as proof that different cultures can not only coexist but make each other stronger. We've built something that will outlast us and influence lives we'll never even know about." "When you put it that way," Thomas said, pulling her close, "Washington seems rather small by comparison. Besides," Ellie added, settling into the circle of his arms, "someone needs to stay here to write the stories that will help the next generation understand how all this became possible. And I can't think of anywhere I'd rather do that than right here with you, watching our children grow up in the world we've helped create." Above them, the prairie stars shone with the same brightness they had offered to generations of previous inhabitants. But below them, something new was taking root. A way of living that honored the past while building toward a future where love could indeed conquer the deepest divides and create something beautiful and new. As Eleanor Whitmore Crowfeather settled into sleep that night, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this place of peace and purpose. She had risen far higher than her original dreams, not just as a successful journalist, but as a woman who had learned to use her voice to heal divisions and create understanding between peoples. And tomorrow would bring new opportunities to continue that work in the company of the man she loved and the community they had built together, one story at a time.